Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Locals, Twitter, and Telegram. I'm also in the process of adding new subscription platforms. In the low bar of the video, you'll see Buy Me a Coffee, and hopefully by next week, I'll have Subscribestar up and running as well. I see we've already got Pillier and Ricardo Williams here. Nice to see you guys. Manoa and Zero World, nice to see you here. Logos Zero World says, "Let the slaughter begin." Intellectually speaking, of course. So
ruin all my fun by limiting it to the intellect.
I know. All right. Let's just go at Moldbug here. Moldbug, separation of information and security, June 9th, 2007. It's come to my attention that some people think UR has a bad attitude, that it wallows in decadent, aestheticized despair under the inexorable velvet grip of the Polygon, pausing only to scoff at the feeble struggles of those deluded fools who call themselves the Resistance. Au contraire, mon frere. Well, okay, I do scoff, but I also offer serious positive proposals for a freer, happier tomorrow. Here's one of the beautiful spring weekend. Okay, let's just stop right here. This is too much. Hold on. First of all, now, granted, he's deleted, because he's reloaded these, all the comments are gone, so we're missing a little bit of what he's talking about here. But, like, this idea of aestheticized despair, no, it's not bad attitude, it's not despair, it's irony and snark, and a lot of pop culture references and positive proposals. All I've heard is about an alien that could snap his finger with a magic ring. Now, I don't know if that constitutes a positive political proposal in your view, Logos, but it doesn't in mine.
We also heard about chimps, right?
Ripping off their you-know-whats, yeah.
Yeah, you have the young chimp and the old chimp. So his positive proposal depends on who's the young chimp and who's the old chimp. So, I mean, he has a lot of positive Schrodinger's proposals.
Yeah, there's a lot of Schrodinger's.
There are.
All right. What do we got here? I believe, and I think everyone should believe, in a separation of information and security. That is, I'm very fond of law and order, and I recognize that security forces are needed to impose it. I also understand that human beings, basically little rock apes, and our little rock ape eyes, ears, and nose do not equip us to understand life, the universe, and everything, at least not on our own. And when a little rock ape grows up knowing nothing about what he sees, hears, and smells, you have a serious menace on your hands. However, I also believe that in a free society, there is no such thing as an official truth. Granted, the security forces need some consistent... we lost Logos. Hold on a second. Okay, he's back. Granted, the security forces need some consistent picture of reality because they need a clear idea of what they should and shouldn't detain, imprison, shoot, or bomb. But this is a very narrow view of the world. It is basically limited to things legal and military. The ugly truth about security is that security, at least when it is done right, is a boring job for boring people. It is not exciting, romantic, or dramatic, and if it is, you should worry. The security forces do not need to have an opinion on whether God is three persons, one, or no person at all. They shouldn't care whether or not the Beatles were better than the Stones. They should favor neither Manchester United nor Bayern München. It need not bother them a bit that Augustus Kleisenslaller is a poet and John Ashbery is a poser, and nor should they sit up late worrying from their former's work is going downhill, whereas the latter has nowhere to go but up unless he gets his hands on some heavy earth-moving machinery. Most people will not quarrel with these statements. However, I also don't think that security forces should have an opinion on whether or not men tend to be better at math than women. I don't think they are or should be qualified to decide whether or not cold fusion is real, or what the global climate sensitivity is, or whether I should or whether I should or should not ingest some chemical. I am not interested in their opinions on sexy movies or first-person shooters. Oh, okay, hold on. I think I know where he's going with this, but this is absolutely horrific. I mean, basically what he's saying is we should just have a bunch of like crazy drones like RoboCop that just shoot people. Because like, if we look at classic political thought, of which, again, I'm going to make a sci-fi reference here, which you should know, Starship Troopers. Those who protect the Commonwealth ought to have moral education, ought to have a moral understanding. This idea that they have to be cold assassins is terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, I have two big issues with this. The first one is pragmatism, right? Can you divorce human beings from their opinions? I don't think so. I think all human beings have them. He even admitted as much, that all human beings have them. So you can't strip people who work security from their individual opinions, if what he said is true, that individuals have opinions, the best you can try to do is something like individuals should not have opinions based on their work as security officers or something. Like they shouldn't mix work with their opinion. I mean, A, good luck with that. And B, do you want that world anyway? Because um I mean, here's something really interesting about that, right? Like he always goes off on Mustache Man, of course, and the NS in Germany. But I mean, what was the big issue during the Nuremberg trials? Well, I was just following orders, right? Soldiers that don't have opinions on the orders they're given just follow them. And we already have historical examples of what happens when people just follow orders without any higher order of opinions on whether they ought to be following the orders or not. So, yeah, I agree. Not only might this be dystopian and terrifying, we have historical precedent of it being dystopian and terrifying. So,
Yeah, well, that's a good tie-in given Moldbug's perennial focus on the mid 20th century Germans. Yeah. Some unease may creep into readers at these bold claims, and when I added that, while it may be a matter of some interest to the security forces whether or not the Federal Reserve caused the Great Depression, the 14th Amendment was properly ratified, or the Mexican War was illegal, I think the security forces are perfectly capable of keeping any opinions they may have on these subjects to themselves. These may be there may be some actual dissent. The problem is that, at least here in the United States, we have something called separation of church and state. I think this is a very good idea. After all, since a church is only a building unless it transmits information, and the state is not a state unless it provides security, separation of information and security must imply separation of church and state. Okay, well, hold on. Let's go back to this. This is the important line here. I think the security forces are perfectly capable of keeping any opinions they may have on these subjects to themselves. There may be some actual dissent. These are all meaningless things to consider. What if the security force is ordered to shoot a civilian? That's the relevant question here. What if the security force, Moldbug, is ordered to round up certain people like yourself that are associated with banking and shoot them? Should they not question those orders, Moldbug?
that, and I mean, let's just go back to his usual analogy he uses for describing what a formalist society would look like, something like Finargle and his magical ring or whatnot, right? Well, he's already said that an analog for Finargle's magic ring would be Mr. Peaceful, the police officer. So Finargle only has the power to secure his position if these officers govern it. But even Moldbug's own model relies on Finargle having some rational reasons he wants to rule. He just wants gold, or he just wants some economic good, or something, right? So there's a rational reason that Finargle wants for keeping and maintaining power. Okay, well, who is it that's going to be to determine whether what Finargle wants is rational or not rational? The only people that are A, close enough to him, and B, have the power to do anything about it if it's not the case, would be the Mr. Peaceful officers that he uses to maintain his power. And so if they're the ones who don't get to have opinions on those very important issues, well, then the unfortunate consequence of that is it doesn't matter if Finargle has an irrational reason for wanting power, like sadism or something else, because Mr. Peaceful, the one that Finargle uses to maintain his power, is now incapable of asking those questions to depose Finargle even if he were an irrational dictator.
Well, just remember, Logos, if the security guards are told to throw 7 Jewish virgins in a mountain of fire, who are they to argue?
It's a good point. I don't want to hear their opinions on the subject.
I don't want to hear it on there. Yeah, I mean, the mountain must be hungry for Jewish virgins. I mean, I don't know what else to say.
Good point.
It's interesting though to ask people why they think separation of church and state is so important. A typical answer is they have a name for a system of government in which the church and the state are not separated. They call it a theocracy. If they had a very expansive, useless education, they might also describe it as Caesaropapism. Theocracy is an interesting word because God, if there is anything at all to the fellow, is at least quite secretive. Literally, theocracy should mean the rule of God, but God works in mysterious ways, so it usually falls on others to explain what he's thinking. Thus, theocracy is more acutely defined as a rule in the name of God. In other words, it involves what we call a security information feedback loop. In a theocracy, you must obey the security forces because the security forces obey God. You know that the security forces obey God because your ministers tell you that the security forces obey God and your ministers obey God. Your ministers obey God because his salary is paid by the security forces who obey God, who only pays ministers who obey God. This money is in turn paid by you to God, since God does not have a bank account as such. Please make your check out to the security forces who will use it to do God's work, etc. It's pretty clear how separation of church and state nips this particular loop in the bud, and it's a good thing too. You see, this is the problem, right? This is his computer brain working, viewing everything as just a loop. I think that's the problem here, right? Because again, it's engineering. There's no morality. Well, hold on, Logos. I thought there was no morality, right? So if there's no morality and you can't have morality in politics, what does he care if there's a theocracy?
Well, I mean, one issue is that theocracies are inherently morally loaded because it's government based on the fact that we ought to do what God tells us or something. So it is an ought based government. Never mind the fact that like we can't have ought based governments. I mean, I see that for what he just said. My clear issue here is it's not clear that he's even defined a loop, because one of the crucial steps of the loop. This is head scratching. So your minister, your security forces obey God because your minister tells you they obey God. Fine. And your minister obeys God. Fine. Your minister obeys God because his salary is paid by the security forces. No, that's backwards. The government, they who run the government, pay the security forces. That's always how it works. How are security forces paying the minister? What? Generally, the government levies taxes. They take the taxes and they allocate the taxes back to the security forces. And so if the security forces aren't being paid, they quit. So it's really not a loop. It's a top-down thing. The minister says they obey God. The minister collects taxes on God's behalf. So it might be tithes and add extra things the Catholic Church used to do in the Middle Ages, for example, if we're going to use that example. Then what happens is your funds go up to the top. That are then redistributed down to the security forces that just enforce people pay their taxes. But it's not like a loop. It's like a one-time transaction from the top that then trickles back down to security forces that do what the government tells them to do. And basically how it goes is it's just like this. You trust what the security forces do because the government says they follow God, and the security forces answer to the government who follows God, and you hope that just works out in your favor transitively. But the problem with theocracies, really, the loop that's a real problem, is what happens if the government isn't following God? And this, of course, is something the Catholics are reckoning with right now. I mean, there are tons of Catholics that are not happy with what the Pope is doing. The Pope is the seat of God, the literal interpreter of God. He's the head honcho. He can rewrite, ex cathedra. I think we talked about this at some point. And so what happens if the Pope goes rogue? Well, the problem with theocracy is if the head of the government is the word of God, they will never go rogue by their own standard as the word of God. And so if this is the type of theocracy he's worried about, then it's that problem uniquely that's an issue. But how is that problem solved? That problem is solved by security forces looking at the rules of government as ordained by God and the actions of the current administrator to match up and see, ought the administrator be giving us these orders, or is it ungodly for him to do it? If they can't ask the question, the administrator gets to uniquely determine what it is that's godly for them to do. And if they can ask that question, well, now there's a two-way kind of power struggle, because the security forces say, if we're a godly government, here's the stuff that's in our charter that's godly for us to do, and we have to ask if we ought to follow the rules you're setting before us. This is the exact time you want to have the security forces having an opinion. But if what he's trying to do is make this argument to say security forces shouldn't, that's really what forces the feedback loop. It's just bizarre.
Yeah, he's not only using the computer term, he's not even applying it accurately to the situation we're looking at. It doesn't get better, does it?
No, it doesn't.
The problem, however, is that while a lion is a cat, not all cats are lions. Some non-lion cats are scary-looking but harmless. Some lions are harmless-looking and harmless. And some non-lions act like pussycats and are extremely large and dangerous. The essential ingredients of security information feedback loop is that security forces teach us to worship them. That is, we treat security forces on their associated agencies, henchmen, or committees as essentially mysterious and benevolent. And they use this influence or other powers to encourage this characterization. Okay, hold on. I gotta take quite umbrage with this paragraph here, right? Who is he talking about? His opponents are the Brahmins on the left. Now, remember, everybody, if you weren't alive, then don't listen. But if you were alive, remember back in 2007, what did the left say about cops? What's been the left's position on cops since time out of mind? ACAB. Who is he talking about, Logos?
Yeah, he's definitely not talking about the left of the for this one. I think this is actually to the neocons because he doesn't like the neocons, he doesn't like the left. I think his target audience for this article is the neocons and their contemporary worship of things like the Department of Homeland Security, and people like that, ICE, people that came up shortly after 9/11, these new mysterious shadow organizations in the government, so to speak, that are in charge of all these different aspects of security that you're kind of not allowed to question. It's like, well, do we really need this extra Department of Homeland Security? It's not clear what their jurisdiction is, not clear who they answer to. I don't know what it is they do exactly. Hey, if you don't like that DSA or no, DHS, sorry, DHS, then you must be for the terrorists, right? That's basically the feedback loop that he's taking umbrage with, I think.
Okay, now that would make a little more sense. But he very seldom goes after the uh, Optimate Vicias, the OVs. So I'm not. See, that's why I'm having a. Your explanation makes sense, Logos, but he very rarely ever goes after the OVs. So I don't know.
I don't think he's attacking them in this one. I think what he's just trying to do is get them to say, I think he knows a lot of his readers are either ex neocons or people that are libertarian but still lean that way, especially after a recently post 9/11 America. Um, and so what he's trying to do is he feels like he's trying to deprogram that aspect of his base who will read him from this particular trait he sees in them.
Okay, that's probably the best explanation we're going to have for this. This god fellow is certainly one way to get the job done. Other familiar figures in the same capacity include Athena, Ahura Mazda, Huitzilopochtli, and so on. But can't we say it's impossible to create a security information feedback loop without the assistance of anthropomorphic paranormal entities? The answer is rather important. If you treat a highly mutable infectious agent with a narrow spectrum antibiotic, you have a recipe for resistance. If a security information feedback can be achieved without the use of God or gods, separation of church and state is in fact pretty much guaranteed to create a much nastier strain of the bug. One way to see this is to look at, oh, he might be writing to new atheists because he's got this idea that you can have like a secular religion kind of thing. And this here seems to be saying that, well, if you have separation of church and state, but you don't have what I'm talking about here, you got like a secular religion security force, a la like the Soviet Union. What do you think of that, Logos?
Yeah, I agree. He's appealing. I think he's appealing to kind of like the Christopher Hitchens types, if we're really trying to narrow it down. The people that are new atheists believe that they're above these theocratic musings and whatnot. But Christopher Hitchens, remembering back in the day, was very pro Iraq War, was very pro, as far as I remember anyway, like DHS, very pro government security organizations, because Islamic terrorism was on the forefront of his mind. He thought it was a real risk. He thought that we needed powerful institutions and government to kind of keep the irrational crazies at bay because they can find more and more creative ways of doing real harm to a lot of people.
Right. One way to see this is to look at how drastic the treatment would have to be. Imagine if you applied separation of information and security to the Western world today in the same way that most of us apply separation of church and state. With church and state, at least since the 1960s, we don't just try to minimize feedback, we try to eliminate it. We look for absolute sterility. In fact, relics of the era where a little feedback was considered harmless, such as the word God on currency, strike most people with at least my background as a little weird. Applying this level of scrutiny to separation of information and security would imply a state that has no involvement at all with education, journalism, broadcasting, science, or the arts. Rather, all these fields would be completely independent. This would be a somewhat different world from the one we live in, so you might want to think for a little before you decide this is a good idea. Well, you see, I mean, this is just analogous to what he's talking about, right? Because this is supposed to be his version of an upgraded separation of church and state. But it's not the case that churches in the United States have no state oversight and no state involvement at all. For example, a lot of churches are basically don't have to pay taxes, but because they don't pay taxes, they can't directly criticize the state. So this isn't even analogous.
Yeah, I mean, there's that, and I'm trying to articulate what's wrong with this here. Um, a state that had no involvement at all with education, journalism, broadcasting, science, or the arts. Rather, all these fields must be completely independent. Like, okay, I don't even know where to start with this. Let's just start with science, right? Why did the state get involved with science? I'll just leave that to you, Todd. What do you think I'm going to say here?
Well, I know what you're going to say. The state wanted to invent new weapon systems.
Manhattan Project, right? It turns out that because what do scientists want? They want funding. Science, it turns out, gets really, really, really expensive as you need more complicated doodads to explore other doodads that make nuclear bombs and soon like quantum bombs. I mean, imagine we master quantum tunneling and we could detonate a bomb like in some cave underwater, and through quantum tunneling, the explosion actually simultaneously happens in like some city around the world, right? Like that would be insanely bizarre technology. You couldn't shoot down the missile, you couldn't do anything. An explosion in one area creates an explosion in the other, boom, with quantum entanglement or some crazy nonsense that we haven't even thought of yet, okay? That's the power of science. But in order for scientists to figure out how the world works to control things to that degree, they need lots of money. And who has all the money? The state has all the money. So of course the state and science are going to get involved. That's how you get the Manhattan Project. This is just dumb. It's never not going to happen. Okay, what's the next one? Let's see. Where was it? There it is. Education, journalism. Okay, broadcasting and the arts. Let's do the arts next, right? Why would the state get involved with the arts? Well, the problem is there was a time when there was a lot of museums and other state-of-the-art things that were in danger of collapsing because people just weren't interested in them to a degree enough to be sustainable. And in fact, there's a perennial problem. This is why artists used to have like individual wealthy people that were their patrons. But here's the problem, Todd. Like, let's think about like what the alternative would be. The alternative would be to go back to like an individual patronage system with the arts. But back when the elites had that kind of power to be the patrons of artists, who were the state, realistically speaking, back then? It was the elite, because it was the aristocracy from which the state drafted the militaries to go to war. So even under an individual patronage system where you have like patrons funding the arts, patrons who have that kind of money to throw around end up being de facto weapons of the state anyway. So you're never going to really untangle that. Every single one of these aspects, all of them, comes down to you have really big projects that need a lot of funding, and you have a really difficult coordination problem where you get a bunch of disinterested parties to coordinate money to make this happen. And so what you generally do is you have one big entity pull disinterested people's funding through taxes to funnel it into a single area of interest, whether it's the arts, the state, or something like that, either directly or indirectly through a patronage system via the elites. Fine. And all of these are going to have that in common. So the idea that you can just separate them, bro, and it's just going to be fine, I don't know how he's going to pull it off.
Well, you can't, because if you got rid of the state as a sort of patron who can acquire capital through taxation, none of these things would happen because it wouldn't be the money.
Exactly.
And that's just the way it is. Tough noogies. I mean, let's see. Oh, logos. This is going to be one that I'm going to have a field day with. Short History of Ultra-Calvinism, June 12th, 2007.
This will be all you, man. Rant away.
Oh, boy. Oh, boy. Over the last 50 years, Time magazine has become as stupid as its audience. The unfortunate fact is that everyone in 2007 who reads Time or any magazine like it, yes, even The Economist, is simply not right in the head. Sometimes I receive random free issues of The Economist or find a crumpled copy in a cafe. And if I accidentally read a few pages or worse, one of the leaders, I fly into a shrieking rage and have to curl up in the closet for a few hours. This rag, which I have loved since I was big enough to go on the big roller coaster, is now devoted utterly and irreversibly to the production and distribution of official mendacity. However, Time was once run by the Luces and the likes of the Whittaker Chambers, and it turned out a word or two in its day. And here's something it gave us on March 16th, 1942, American Malvern. Unfortunately, any slice I could slice from this content would be unconvincing. The whole thing must be read in its natural habitat. Now, that isn't an interesting article. Don't the phrase organized U.S. Protestantism's super Protestant new program kind of jump out at you here? Again, Logos, where the heck are the Protestants? They don't run the Supreme Court, and they're not in the big tech companies. Who are these people, Logos?
I don't know. We've talked about this a lot. It's still not exactly clear what they're responsible for in this guy's worldview.
Especially being as where it is in the first sentence after a grand total of 6 words, organized U.S. Protestantism super protest new program. It's almost as if you were a reader of Time in 1942 and you read an article which uses the phrase organized U.S. Protestantism super Protestant new program. you'd be expected to have some idea of what in the great jumpin' bejesus it was talking about. Now, if we can scan slightly further into the text, we see some names. Who the heck, for example, is John R. Mott? Who sings of John R. Mott today? I have no idea, but apparently in 1942 he was a well-known layman. Only one rings a bell to me, Irving Fisher. Irving Fisher was a prohibitionist and an inflammationist. Pretty much everything that Doughboy done was wrong. So I'm on my guard. We also see some denominations, or at least institutional affiliations, and one thing we note is that all of these affiliations are essentially low church in nature. In the British terminology, if they are not dissenters, they are close. And the British low church tradition is basically Calvinist in nature. So we can sharpen Times wording and describe this incomplete shindig as not just Protestant, note the small p here, and the use of the word as a normal descriptive adjective of public policy, just as one might say communist or liberal or fascist, but in fact Calvinist. When you change one's words, it's usually good to change two. So let's define the 2007 descendants of the super Protestant as ultra-Calvinist. Google gave only 4 hits for this concoction, basically meaning the same thing, but not having any weird connotations of comic book powers and allowing for some semantic drift. I'll let the content of the Time article speak for itself. Clearly, if you have trouble identifying the 2007 equivalent of 1942 super Protestant, you have historical disorder. Perhaps you should spend less time watching Al Jazeera, and I also have the sad honor of informing you that Hugo Chavez is not in fact the second coming of Thomas Jefferson. If you disagree, especially if you disagree violently with this assertion, I will have to suggest that these are other blogs you could read. Now, how should we classify ultra-Calvinism? Okay, man, it's gonna be rough, guys. Buckle up. Well, we can start by taking it at face value, or at least trying to, which we know Moldbug won't, so let's keep going. We immediately know that unlike its uniquely mysterious ancestor, the super Protestant thing, ultra-Calvinism, does not claim to be Christian at all. It usually claims to be secular, whatever that means, or even atheistic. Although you will get the occasional Michael Lerner type who defends it as deeply spiritual. Here at UR, we know that theism and idealism are basically the same thing, and anything you can do with one, you can do with the other. Just think of them as an alternative surface protein variations. Any immune response aimed at specific gods, say Osiris, or ideas such as equality or the environment, will be evaded almost instantaneously. Any aimed at all theisms, idealisms, or anything in between is far too broad and will never work. Any aimed at idealism alone is a great way to cultivate a flowering crop of theisms and vice versa. This is why we are not into the so-called Dawkins, Hitchens, Harris, etc. treatment here at UR. Ultra-Calvinism appears to be pretty much the same thing as Unitarianism, that is in the 2007 sense of the word. This is also interesting because Unitarians of one form or other have been running the United States since the day it was born. The doctrines have changed wildly, of course, but the name is not, although now it is not so often used. But, for example, if you can detect any distinction between Unitarian Universalism and political correctness, for example, a proposition on which the two conflict, your eyes are sharper than mine. Often ultra-Calvinism even has the sheer unmitigated goal to present itself as opposite of Christianity. More broadly, it is a superior revelation of what Christianity, along with all other religions, is a mere anticipation, a kind of lamey-ass John the Baptist point, the way figure. Backward people who refuse to accept this inevitable transition are called fundamentalists if they do not accept it. They are moderates, or some other term, approbation. This also interesting to track the relationship between ultra-Calvinism and Marxism. Is Marxism a branch of ultra-Calvinism or vice versa? Or are they all siblings or something else? Perhaps this is a fun exercise for the reader. If the prehistory of the ultra-Calvinism interests you, 3 books you may find interesting are The War for Righteousness by Richard Gamble, Lincoln the Man by Edgar Lee Masters, The 3 New Deals by Wolfgang Schäublesbuch. A good one-piece starter is an old article of Murray Rothbard's, was just reported. World War I is the fulfillment of power in the intellectuals. And there's also a post-history of super Protestantism. A few weeks ago, I mentioned a book that claimed had the best blurb in history of the solar system. I am now prepared to reveal the identity of this remarkable masterpiece of the 20th century verbiage. This book was published in 1964, although my edition is from 66. A really beautiful and timeless slipcase edition from Alfred A. Knopf. The slipcase has an elegant modernist 3-color design, sea blue and black red. And with the author's name and the name of the book and the translator Leif Jorberg and W.H. Auden, The dust cover is white linen with no design, and its front shows the author's name and title in a large sea blue italics, and then under this, in a large but not tastelessly large serif Roman, the quote, "The noblest self-disclosure of spiritual struggle and triumph, perhaps the greatest treatment of personal devotion published in this century." This is signed tastefully and simply in very small italics. The New York Times Book Review. This book is markings by Dag Hammarskjöld, and it very rewards the reader, and it very much rewards the reader. It's not precisely as the author or reviewer or translator. What was he thinking? Gee, I can't even begin to guess. Intended. Update. 2 other interesting books, chiefly notable because they are like the Shivelbush, written recently by well-credentialed authors who are considered themselves liberal or even socialist or authoritarian socialism in America, by Arthur Liplow and The Dark Side of the Left, Illiberal Egalitarianism in America, by Richard J. Ellis, and The Bellamy Salute is not to be missed. Okay, so there's another article about this that I'm really waiting for, so I'll give you some responses here, though. So first of all, I don't know what this article is about that he's talking about, quote-unquote, super Protestantism. It's just probably some prohibitionist thing. There were the sort of some liberal Protestants in New England that still existed at the time that were supportive of FDR. But let's look at all the absurdities here. First thing, we have Unitarianism, the belief that there is one God in the Godhead. Calvinists believe in Trinitarianism. So ipso facto, Calvinists are not Unitarians and vice versa. I mean, this is just so painfully, idiotically stupid that this guy just cannot be trusted on anything that he says. Furthermore, I don't know what he means by ultra-Calvinist, right? There's a term in theology called hyper-Calvinism, which is the belief that there is a sense of double predestination. God predestines man both to salvation and damnation. And there's a weaker form of Calvinism which just says God only predestines the elect, and the non-elect, well, tough noogies. But he didn't actively choose to damn them. He just didn't choose to elect them. So I don't know what that is supposed to mean, especially if you're going to equate Calvinists with Unitarians, who, again, he gets into this in more detail, so I'll get into it more detail there. Let's just stick to the Trinity. Enough said right there. And then he's like, oh, well, it's just like, it's a Marxism. Well, first of all, as I've already stated in I think it was last week's episode, Unitarians were transcendentalists. They were basically like, appealing to the Eastern views with like Hinduism, et cetera, et cetera. You can think of like Emerson and Thoreau. Obviously not Christian. Obviously. Unitarianism is a revival of the ancient heresy of Arianism. So any basic understanding of Christian doctrine can tell you that these people are not Christians, never have been Christians. And he said they claim to be secular. And then Marxism. I mean, but they're not Marxists either, because a lot of these people are, Emerson, was he a Marxist? No. Thoreau was an anarchist. So maybe they were anarchists. I mean, there's so much that could be said, but I'll have to wait till the next article where he goes into the next time he brings up ultra-Calvinism, because there's a 4-part breakdown, which is going to get really juicy.
There's one part here I can explain, I think, that give you some more context, right? Because you're right. He was using these words in a totally off his rocker manner. Like ultra-Calvinism would be the furthest thing from Unitarianism you could possibly think of if he's doing a theological analysis of this.
That'd be the Deep South.
Exactly, but he's not. He's doing a structural analysis, basically, where the more Calvinist, so think about like a single pole describing Christianity, like a line. And on one side of the line, you're getting toward papacy and high church organization. The other side, you're getting to low church organization and like the Protestant theses and so on, right? So Calvinism is just what he's calling getting more Protestant or getting more decentralized as far as church authority goes. And non-Calvinism would be higher church authority, some kind of Anglicanism, like high church Anglicanism, the Pope and Catholicism, something like that. That's how he means to be using these words. And so what he means by ultra-Calvinism has nothing to do with Calvinism, the theology. He's just meaning super grassroots, super no church authority, until you get to Unitarianism, which is like, yeah, believe whatever you want. We're still going to call ourselves a Christian denomination in some bizarre instances of it I've seen. And that's basically what he's talking about here. He's not even talking about like conservative Puritans or Calvinists or anything of the sort. with that in mind, what might you have to say about that?
Well, first of all, that's still bogus because the classic reformed form of church government is Presbyterianism, which is an intermediate position between the Episcopal form of government of the Orthodox and the Catholics and the Anglicans on the one hand, and the Congregationalism of the Baptists on the other. So that doesn't even work.
He should be calling it ultra-Baptist then instead of ultra-Calvinist.
Yes. But furthermore, a lot of these liberal people, a lot of these New Deal liberals, they were Episcopalians. I mean, like, I think FDR was an Episcopalian. It's ridiculous. I mean,
Good point.
and again, a lot of these people are Catholics too, by the way. Remember,
Joe Biden's a Catholic. Pelosi's a Catholic.
Yeah, I know. So was Kennedy. So were the Kennedys. I mean,
where's this coming from?
It's literally insane bonkers. Like, he can't even use his terms right. And this is really weird too, right? Because since Moldbug likes to stand on his ethnicity so much, what country has been the haven for his people? It was the United States. I mean, there were Jewish members of the American Revolution that had levels of freedom and opportunity for upward mobility nowhere seen in the world.
Good point. Here's another interesting point too. Where do you think that Judaism would fall on his scale of congregationalism versus like centralized church authority?
Oh well, they're clearly the proto-Marxists, right? I mean, who? Let's think of all the thinkers. Where were they coming from? Where were the Marxists coming from, Logos?
That's a good point. I mean, also just thinking about it on the church scale, would Judaism be more congregationalist, do you think, or more centralized? Because the way I have a view of it is like different synagogues just kind of do their own thing, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, in that regard, I guess you could say synagogues would be if what you say is true, because I haven't studied Jewish government in its current form, Jewish synagogue government. That would be sort of like Eastern Orthodoxy's autocephalous, right? Where they're autocephalous and you can be, there's no pope standing over above you. But well, I think properly understood in the Torah, there is this sense of congregationalism. With the rise of the Talmud and the priority of the priesthood, I don't see that. I mean, in a lot of ways, a lot of these Jewish are like the Catholics. They appeal to an unwritten Torah, like the Catholics appeal to an unwritten tradition. I mean, what does that sound interesting? There was an interesting debate between Nick Fuentes and what was his name? It was like a boomer con alt-light Jewish guy, and the Jewish guy brought up the oral Torah. Nick Fuentes is like, no, there's no oral Torah. Moses didn't have an oral Torah. I'm like, good, Nick. Well, you know what else? There isn't also a oral testimony from Jesus either. You might want to go all the way with that, Nick. But I think Jews would be Catholics in that regard. I mean, who's the other half of the Supreme Court, Logos?
Good point. So it sounds like he's just got this all flipped around, honestly. It sounds like he's trying to blame like lower church authority for what's going on. But he's got like his line flipped. It sounds like most of the stuff that government's doing he doesn't like is coming from higher authority church stuff, not lower authority church stuff.
Well, exactly, because obviously, if we're running a complicated top-down structure, the people that are running it can't be the ones at the bottom.
Well, then they have to have a penchant for structural authority anyway, right? So like if top-down government authority were so anathema to you, and that's why you're a congregationalist in the sense of Christianity, why would you try to like work that through in the government? That doesn't make a lot of sense. It sounds like you'd self-select for people that had this same view of authority to get them to enact the policies you're looking for.
Well, again, we have Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists, where they supported the separation of church and state, because they didn't want to have a repeat of the Church of England, where they got arrested and put in prison.
Good point.
So again, Moldbug is living in this parallel pocket dimension of hyper-reality, which bears no relevance to anything outside of his own mind. I mean, I just, there we go. UR will return on Wednesday, June the 12th, 2007. I'm making a brief tour of Fenargland to reassure the tenants and restore order. Wait, Logos, why does he need to? Fenargo's got the ring. He can just snap his fingers.
Officer Peaceful is taking a vacation day.
Right, I guess. Okay, basically what happened was this. Nick Sasbo challenged me. In case it's not obvious, We are both very advanced in our training. Well, he might be, but I don't think you are, Nick, or Mencius. So we explained until we were 7 or 8 stories tall and pretty much transparent, and rose buoyant to the upper ocean where, like drunken pirates, we groped and slashed in the lukewarm shallows. Nick has practiced a lot, but frankly, the force isn't really strong in him, and he would have been defeated had not his 9 extraordinary eunuchs arrived on their giant black lizard horses and joined me from the rear. But before they could pin me down, I tossed my sword, Delia did, to my left hand, and in one great blow smote off my right, which bore the ring of Finargle, sending hand and ring together, spinning into the sun. At once Nick's black blade broke me from crown to crotch, but the deed was done, and 15 hours later the ring exploded in the sun. Oh, well, this is where the ring goes, Logos, destroying it and all other magic rings. Since that day, men have spoken only of the 99-fingered neuters. Unexpectedly, this event also resurrected all victims of the ring, including my unfortunate girlfriend, who was understandably cross but mollified to learn that while women may be attracted to money and power, they are turned off by bad dental hygiene, indolence, and an inability to attend to basic household chores. The downside, although, is that it has also brought back a number of bad actors, agitators, frankly, who Finargland was better off without. So while security remains a core corporate competition, from now on, we'll have to implement it within the bounds of ordinary physical law. We'll look at how this works when we get back. So basically, there's no way to be secure then, Logos, because there's no ring anymore. There's no unambiguous security to title.
I mean, he's just saying he's going on hiatus, basically, is what the post is saying in a comical way, and this Nick guy has something to do with it. Everything else just seems to be kind of a tall tale, I suppose.
Fair enough. Fiction and theory and practice. In my first post, I defined violence as the combination of conflict and uncertainty. This was a mistake. Not that the analysis was wrong, but the practice of redefining words like violence with their inalienable emotional connotations is rhetorically foul. It makes me think of the egregious George Lakoff, who wrote a whole book to define freedom as everything that is sweet and good and true, at least in George Lakoff's opinion. And then, of course, there's Obama and so on. So let me work back over this idea, as bloggers always must. Who reads archives anyway? Well, Logos, you and I read archives, so there you go.
There you go.
A blog is not a book and uses a different word, friction. I figure friction is a fair game because I don't think anyone who has any strong feelings, good or bad, about friction is in the abstract. It is true that many of us have suffered from friction, for example, through chafing. On the other hand, it makes or breaks work and keeps us from falling on our butts, and the prospect of eradicating it from the earth seems most improbable and unappealing. Therefore, we can, I hope, regard it with some small calm. Conflict exists when 2 men or women want the same thing, but only one can have it. Economists call this a scarce resource. Scarce resources are everywhere. My car, for example, is a scarce resource. Unfortunately, well, no, that's not true at all, Logos, because conflict can exist over non-scarce resources by the artificial means of making it appear to be scarce with intellectual property.
True.
So if he's a libertarian, so he's got to know this. You can't own intellectual property. Consilla says so, and most libertarians agree. So you can make it artificially scarce by illegal fiction, which then creates conflict. Now the conflict is real, even if the scarcity isn't. So he should know this. Uncertainty exists whenever it is difficult to predict the outcome of a conflict. For example, you may want my car. This is only because you haven't seen it, but it has an ignition lock, and I have the title, and the full military power of the United States is on my side. This is only because it doesn't know me. So it's easy. Well, I mean, I don't know, Logos. If somebody from the hood just jacks his car, is the U.S. going to do anything about it?
They used to. I don't know so much about today.
Yeah, well, again, this is 2007, so probably. So it's easy for both of us to predict that your chance of obtaining my car without my consent is quite small. But if we lived in, say, Gaza City, things might be different. For example, suppose you were an adherent of the People's Front of Gaza, an extremist terrorist gang, whereas I paid dues only to the peaceful, moderate, and democratic Gazan Popular Front. If the former rose up and drove the latter into the sea, it's certainly possible there might be something you could speak to on the subject of my car. And it's quite possible that I could feel the need to accept this fiat accompli In which case, although there was friction between the PFG and the GPF, there is none between us. The car is now yours, and it was once mine. Nothing says we can't be perfectly civil about it. However, it's also possible that I might have a cousin or two in the PFG, and if any such uncertainty exists, the result is friction. We both expect effort towards resolving the conflict in our respective directions. We may expend some ammunition as well, or we may just expend time, vocal cords, bribes, and innumerable cups of tea. In any case, the labor is an unproductive by any conventionally definition productivity. Okay, hold on a second. I'm going to do something here. I'm going to look up the physics definition of friction because I'm going to tell you it's probably not relevant to human interactions. Friction. Definition. The force of static friction is the force between two surfaces that prevents those surfaces from sliding or slipping across each other. Now, is that a relevant description of a dispute over car logos?
Kind of. I mean, there's only one weird sense in which it applies. Basically, like, if somebody wants your car, I think a better word to use would be inertia, right? So the car is currently your car, and there are forces in society that keep it at rest, being your car. Only a greater force is going to move the car to being your car if you want my car, basically. Um, so that's basically friction's just kind of a stand-in for inertia. You have to have a greater force to dislodge something from a current social state if you want it to change. And the car is just an example of that.
Right, but the problem here is what Moldbug is doing by using these words carelessly is he's creating the impression that all human interactions are just reducible to the physical chemical reactions we find in nature, which
I,
is not.
I think he's just trying to make an analogy. I think a
Well,
poor
hold
word.
on, but Logos, let's go back. Everything's an engineering problem. There's no morality.
Hmm.
We got to keep all of this within. If there's any consistency to be found in Moldbug, he's a materialist that wants to flatten everything and make it devoid of any higher meaning.
Right.
And I think this is what this is doing here.
Could be. Yeah, because he's ignoring the question of, like, is it right that I have my car and you don't? And he's just focusing on the question of what would it take for my car to become your car?
Well, we don't ask that question, Logos. Remember, we don't ask who owns what, why, just that they own it.
Uh,
So that was the very first article in the blog. Remember the very first blog entry.
well, yeah, he's trying to explain where the uncertainty comes from, right? In the perfect society, we wouldn't ask who owns it. We would just know who owns it. And what he's trying to explain is what it would take to take the optimal question, who owns the car, and make it the unoptimal question of, well, who owns the car? One is a descriptive one, just tell me who owns
Right.
it. And the other one is like, who owns it after these future events?
Yeah. In theory, it's important to distinguish between uncertainty, which is incalculable risk, and probability, which is calculable. Oh, okay, Logos. What do you got to say to that?
I missed it. Say it again.
In theory, it's important to distinguish between uncertainty, which is incalculable risk, and probability, which is calculable.
Well, that seems reasonable enough to me.
Okay. I mean, you're the stats guy. I don't know what the proper answer is. I want to get your take on that.
Yeah, I mean the idea is like a probability involves a probability distribution. So you have a rough idea of how the outcome should carry out when you do the trial. And uncertainty or indeterminacy would be the more general thing. 'Cause the outcome's indeterminate, but I don't know like what its distributions are going to look like or anything like that.
Okay. For example, if both of us could agree on the probability of the car's eventual disposition, let's say 70% for me, 30% for you, we'd find it easy to compromise. 30% of a car is not so useful, but we could agree to have it appraised and could give you 30% of the market price. Of course, this would be a contribution to the victorious people of Gaza, not a mere bribe, kickback, or shakedown. But calculable properties are pretty rare in practice. Prediction markets can help with this, but bear in mind that a market price is just an average opinion, not a magic 8-ball. Nevertheless, I always wonder why some brave soul hasn't set up a prediction markets for judicial decisions. See, this is also interesting too, Logos. You know, all this crass commodification of everything. How is this trad? I mean, do you think somebody living like, in rural France circa 1100 viewed life as just commodity prices?
Well, Yeah, and the other problem too, this is really eye-opening to me as well, because one of the big problems we have with the left today, or should I say society has, is there's a fundamental difference in views. The left has this idea of stochastic terrorism, and the idea that if something can be a possible harm, you have to mitigate something because it's a possible harm. Now, Moldbug actually seems to be leaning into that, right? If there's a 30% chance I could take your car, the mere possibility that I could take your car at, say, 30%, now entitles me to part of your car. In the same way that the possibility that your words could cause somebody to hurt somebody else means we should penalize you for your words. Possible outcomes are enough to cause real penalties, basically. Some part of society believes that way. Another part of society doesn't believe that way. They're completely retroactive. When something happens, then we'll fix it, right? And this whole stochastic thing versus retroactive thing is kind of a left-right divide. Moldbug here, by his own admission, is leaning really squarely on kind of like the left-wing model of the world here, in a way that it's really hard to figure out like how he's right-wing, at least in the current climate, if he still holds this belief.
Right. I agree with that insight, but it's also hard to argue that he's quote trad in the way that a lot of these people, like say trad cats and orthobros, who like him are, because again, in this sort of medieval setting that these people envision, people weren't going around in day-to-day life saying, "Oh, I wonder what the predictive futures markets are going to be for the price of grain." I don't know.
Right.
That's ridiculous. That's not trad. In a frictional conflict, both sides may estimate a probability. But since uncertainty exists, there is no reason for their calculations to match, and so no reason for their respective estimates of success to sum to 100%. It's only human nature to overstate one's own chances, and in conflicts between organizations such as states, companies, or even people's fronts, it's almost impossible. So the joint expected value can be and typically is 150, 180%, etc., leaving a lot of room for noble sacrifice. Note that this is a very different theory of violence than the prevailing progressive ultra-idealist or ultra-Calvinist view, which of course is basically Christian and attributes all violence and other bad behavior to the fact that everyone is not Christian enough. Of course, ultra-Calvinists generally do not put it this way, being not Christians but crypto-Christians. Logos, what does that even mean? That's just a word salad of gibberish.
I can try to untangle it. Um, so he's this. Okay, let's suppose we're in a conflict about your car, right? I think that I have a 70% chance of taking your car from you. You think that if I try to take your car from you, you have a 70% chance of holding the car from me. So there's a 70% chance from your perspective your car stays with you. There's a 70% chance from my perspective your car goes with me. The probabilities aren't going to add up to 100% there, because the same outcome is getting assigned two different probabilities based on perspective. So that's the first part there. Now, I think he's making things too complicated. You don't even need to have probabilities mismatched to get people thinking they should do different options, right? We could both agree that I only have a 30% chance of taking the car from you, and you have a 70% chance of holding your car. The real issue here is risk, right? So if I try to take your car from you, what's the worst that can happen to me? Best case scenario, I get your car. Isn't that awesome? Now, if worst case scenario is something like I die, maybe that's bad enough to be a deterrent. Okay. But if let's say I get away with the attempt to try to take your car and nothing happens, well, then it just becomes something like I have a 70% chance to get, or a 30% chance to get Todd's car and a 70% chance to go home with nothing. I'll just take a 1 in 3 chance for a free car. That sounds pretty awesome, right? Um, so one thing he's not thinking of is the risk. People can agree on probabilities, but just disagree on the risks if something goes wrong. Um, so that's one thing I think that's missing from his analysis. The other thing that's missing from his analysis is the odd question. Let's suppose we both agree on the probabilities and both agree on the risks. That's still not enough to deter it, because some people are gamblers. Some people say, you know what, looking at the probabilities and risks, I think gotta take the gamble because gambling's fun. And other people are risk averse. They look at the same probabilities, the same risks, and they go like, that's a little risky. I think I ought to stay home tonight and not try to take Todd's car, right? So the fact that two people can look at the same data, same risks, and so on, and come to different ought conclusions about whether they're going to be risk averse tonight or not and try to take Todd's car, That's also enough to cause conflict. The problem is Moldbug is incapable of having this part of it as his analysis because he has this view where people can act completely and totally immorally, or amorally, rather. I misspoke. Amorally. Um, but that's impossible because you can look at the same data, the same risks, and have two different conclusions on if you're going to take a gamble on the data. And that ultimately comes down to a normative or moral question. And so until he gets that back into his analysis, that's always going to elude him.
Okay, I wasn't going to interrupt you because that was a really good point, but the point that I was actually getting at was how can Unitarians who aren't Calvinists, who are basically Christians, be not really Christians?
Oh, yeah. So basically, again, ultra-Calvinist in this instance should just mean like ultra-Congregationalist. And some Unitarians will go as far as to say that they are not Christian in the sense that they're not only Christian. They're like Universalist Unitarians, like all roads lead to truth and so on. So you don't have to believe like the Christian creeds to be saved and so forth. And so I think that's where he's going with it.
Well, but then again, if we're just going to say this is about structures,
Yeah.
then what does violence have to do with it?
Well, the theory of violence comes from original sin of humans, basically. That's basically the jab he's taking at Christianity here. It's like all violence and conflicts happen because people have these immoral impulses that come from original sin and a bunch of other stuff. And the only time that Unitarians come into play there is they probably wouldn't take the
Well, they don't believe in original sin. It's like these are the
right.
people that are like, we need to have better environmental conditions for poor people. That will end violence.
Exactly. And this is why he calls them crypto-Christians, in the sense that he thinks that Marxists and all, quote, idealists believe that there's some fundamental force in the world that shapes people to behave in certain immoral ways. And if only we could fix that force, either by manipulating the environment, through Christ's salvation, through whatever else, human beings are going to be A-okay. And he thinks he's got the right answer. He's the, quote, skeptic, and he's going to say that it's not some force in the world that does it. You're not going to solve this ideally through salvation or manipulation, Marxism, whatever. It's a fundamental feature of human beings that he's locking down to this conflict model he's proposing here.
Yeah, he'll solve it with the ring of Finargle.
Exactly. Oh, yeah. Officer Peaceful and the Ring of Finargle will solve all this. Every other system is the idealist one.
Right. But didn't we already agree that Moldbug was really an idealist?
Of course we did. Of course we did. Like, this is so goofy.
But violence in the philosophy of the New York Times, Obama, Lakoff, and the like seems to always be the result of one of three things: a violation of the golden rule, the cycle of violence theory; justified violence, a natural response to poverty, as in Obama's quiet riot theory, I bring not peace but a sword; and C, any other psychological aberrations, inexplicable failures to be enlightened, and other forms of medieval ignorance, all of which would vanish away if we could just get an NPR station in Gaza City. Okay, see, this is what's interesting, right? There's sort of two things we can look at here, right? A broader theory of human nature, but I think the really interesting thing here is what's not being said, right? Let's go back. B, justified violence, response to poverty, right? And then C, failures to be enlightened. Now, the thing here is that, okay, these progressive types, as we already mentioned in our last episode, is that there was the rise of private power, which led to the corresponding rise in the public power of the state. A lot of this violence that they'll say, okay, this violence is justified and this violence is not. They will say, the people that he's criticizing, Obama, the New York Times crowd, that if you are the victims of these private institutions, we call corporations, then that's when violence is legitimate to use. Whereas against, other people, that's just terrible, right? Because that's racist, sexist, homophobic, whatever. Now, Moldbug might have a point if you said that you can't take that tack and on the same hand be this enlightened pacifist. But, not everybody does that. Now, Gandhi did take the enlightened pacifist position, but simultaneously didn't argue for using violence against people that had private power. So, again, a lot of these things get jumbled up.
Yeah, don't got much to add there.
Okay. The point of the friction model is that friction is rational. Therefore, it cannot be easily eradicated by missionaries, no matter how many Bibles they have discarded. In terms of its intellectual parentage, or as many as the or as doubters may prefer, pathology. The frictional model of violence is best seen as a case of Misesian praxeology falling in Rothbard's categories B2, BC, to C and D, basically politics, war, and game theory. It's important to know that praxeology does not assume rationality in the dumbed-down homo economicus form, something peddled by university economists. It does not attempt to construct any objective definition of utility. It does not attempt to construct. It defines subjective rational preference as the consequence of any intentional act. Action reveals a preferred state of the world. For example, to a Misesian, a suicide bomber in a Starbucks can be rational if the fact that he presses his red button is the result of the fact that he wants to turn a world that contains a man in a cafe into one that contains a mess of ball bearings, blood, and shrapnel frappuccinos. And charred frappuccinos. However, if he has Down syndrome and is whacked out on magic mushrooms and has no idea what will be the result of pressing the button or why he should care, he is not rational. Non-rational acts certainly cause problems, though they will always be undiagnosed schizophrenic or two lurking behind you in the subway. But most suicide bombers, I believe, are in the former variety. Now, this is yours, Logos. What's your take on this?
I understand that, like, for intro econ classes, there is this dumb homo economicus idea that he's talking about. Once you get to graduate level economics and you get past the toy models of like utility curves and stuff like that, everything ends up becoming probabilistic. Everything ends up becoming expected utilities. And so you have things you want, you have probabilities you think that you'll get them, and then you have like your risks if you fail and things of that nature. And that model basically already encapsulates his friction view of violence. It's not even new. Attributing it to like Misesian libertarians and stuff is kind of silly because we've had these expected utility models for a while. You don't need an objective definition of utility. You just need a subjective definition of utility, which is what economists have had for a while. And then what you have is revealed preferences. So I don't know what an objective view of utility is. People have their own subjective ones. In aggregate, those subjective views of utility make markets, right? They all get together, they buy, sell things, whatever, and that determines prices ultimately, which determine markets. And so you get revealed preferences through something like that. So a lot of what he's saying doesn't apply. I mean, I can see why he'd see it as like in like an intro econ class, but at the graduate level, his friction model is like already there and has been for a long while. So I don't get the gripe here.
Yeah. All right. In case all this theory is too dry, let's look at some actual forms that friction takes in the real world today. As Clausewitz, for one, observed, the lines between these flavors are never sharp. Nevertheless, they are different enough to deserve their own terms. Friction in the general case can be defined as war. In war, we use any means that may be effective to achieve our objectives. For example, you want my car, I want to shoot you, bang. Before problem, now no problem. Maybe I get my cousins together and we shoot your family too. Poor encounter our tours. Well, no, see, this isn't war, Logos. War is not just random individual violence. War is organized violence by the state. Bro, come on. Like, I thought he was a libertarian using all this, jargon about Westphalia.
Right.
This isn't war. This is a drive-by. Give me a break.
Yep.
No, what war would be is if a bunch of crazy people wanted to attack, the rootless cosmopolitans like Moldbug, who weren't doing nobody no harm, and then throw them into the volcano as a sacrifice to the volcano god. That's a war. Okay. Of course, this is the Gaza City scenario. In San Francisco, these means would not only be ineffective, they would be counterproductive. This, I feel, is one of the reasons these places with such similar Mediterranean climate seem so different. Instead, we could construct any kind of uncertainty as to who owned the car. We'd probably settle it with a lawsuit, which takes our friction in the realm of politics. Wait, Logos, I thought politics was bad because politics was democratic. And the whole point here was to create a social order that got rid of politics.
I also thought that courts were bad because the judiciary was just another branch of politics, adding a bunch, right? Because the power behind the judiciary makes the court's decision making also opaque and behind further branches of further levers of power. You had that whole rant about against the courts as well. Yeah.
Funny how that all works out, huh, Logos?
No, it's not funny. It makes my head hurt.
In politics, we use non-forceful methods to pursue our claims, but the effect at least as it pertains to the car is the same. One of us gets it, and there is no way to tell in advance which one of us it will be. Wait, that's
Okay.
not true. And there was no way to tell. So wait, so going to court is always a 50-50 coin toss, Logos?
Well, it's not 100%. I mean, there's some cases where you go and you just look, you think, man, this guy is going to be fine. And a judgment comes down and it's just like, whoa. I mean, a good example would be like the Amber Heard Johnny Depp case. Amber Heard paid a lot of lawyers a lot of money to try to sue Johnny Depp. No, Depp sued Heard. I'm sorry, I got that completely backwards. Um, sorry, Amber Heard worked with journalists. They put a lot of money and time into conspiring to write articles against Johnny Depp, right? Johnny Depp sues Heard. Well, Johnny Depp lost his case in like 3 different courts, right? In the UK and like I think a couple other ones as well. Finally gets to the US. And I think I heard people say that some of the laws were a little more lax in the UK. I thought that his case against the Sun would be like a bigger slam dunk. And if it came to America, it'd be even harder. But he ended up winning his case in America, right? So like his outcome was not predetermined, I guess is the point I was trying to make here. And both sides are spending a lot of money, time, lawyers, and whatever because they think they have the shot at winning. And I think that's what Moldbug's trying to say is once it gets to the court, everybody lawyers up, everybody puts a bunch of money in, and
Right.
it's like a giant casino. So maybe this is Moldbug also once again talking bad about the courts because courts are even not formalist enough for his liking,
Well,
which would
let
be
me put it this
consistent.
way. It sounds like that statement was a statement of uncertainty when I think properly construed courts cases are a probability question.
Yeah, because you have precedent.
Yeah, because you have precedent and you also have the presumed character of the judge. So
Right.
then in which
So
case it's not true to say that there's no way to tell in advance because that sounds like a very strong uncertainty claim rather than a weaker probability claim.
yeah, I think what he should have said is there's no way to guarantee the outcome, even if we have a probabilistic model of what it should be based on precedent and other things.
There, sure. Politics can be defined as limited warfare. For example, you can see a democratic election as a form of civil war in which both sides agree to settle the conflict by simply counting soldiers. While this is a long way from war in which tank battles are legitimate but poison gas is not, the principle is the same and no qualitative line can be drawn between the two. And you cannot separate force from non-force, militants from civilians, etc., etc. I think this is kind of interesting because I've been seeing this distinction made a lot even now recently with appeals to Carl Schmitt. The problem is politics is not a species of warfare. I already gave an example on another stream that I did on what is a friend. Imagine if you have a planet that's virgin, completely uninhabited, and an intentional community settles there. There is no group of intelligent beings to declare opposition to, but they have a specific way of life that they can't pursue on Earth, but this virgin planet allows them to. Is what they're doing not politics? Well, of course it's politics, but because then there's going to be disagreements on what means are the best way to achieve the ends. But that's not war. And I think what's happened is by just reducing all politics to war, we've gotten ourselves into an impossible problem.
Not only that, but he's stacking the deck. This is pretty fallacious here, right? Let's rewind back and go really meta. So the entire point of his philosophy is trying to end violence, right? But you go back to his chimp analogy, you got the young chimp, old chimp problem. Eventually, a political system, even a formalist one, by which we all agree who's in charge, becomes the old chimp. And that our agreements about who's in charge are superficial, and really people are kind of backing a new system and prefer a new system. It just hasn't been made formal yet. Why not? The chimps have to fight. Why do the chimps fight? There's either a democratic transition of power, or there is a violent transition of power by revolution or something, right? But what he's just done and said here is the nonviolent transition of power, democratic voting, is still a form of war, which is the violent transition of power. So if his project is to nullify political violence, by his own admission, that's impossible because either the two branches by which a new system will usurp an old one um, will end violently by his own definition here. That's absurd.
Yeah, I know. I know. It's not getting better. It's not getting better. It would be iconoclastic of me to stand up for poison gas. Well, A, when does that ever stop Moldbug logos? Let's be honest.
I don't know.
But this would be taking il gran rafido slightly too far. While arms limitation is not my favorite mechanism of controlling friction, I prefer the rule of law. Wait, but you don't like courts, logos. How can you say this?
Well, he wants a rule of law not imposed by courts, basically. He just wants a formalist system where here's the rules, and we just don't even need judges and stuff to figure it out. We just know what
So
the
because
outcome's
we're all
always going to be.
rational actors, right? Is that why? Is that it, Logos?
Yes. He basically
Oh.
wants Judge Dredd. He wants Judge Dredd with the Ring of Power.
It certainly works, and there's much to be said for it. The trick is making sure that there's no incentive to escalate. Well, that ought to be interesting. How do we do that, Moldbug? For example, despite the barbaric and pointless attacks on civilians perpetrated by both sides in World War II, poison gas was never used in combat, which I attribute to the fact that each side was prepared to deploy it almost instantly if the other did. So no advantage, but a temporary surprise could be obtained by resorting to this measure, and even that advantage would be more than canceled out by the political consequences. The story may be apocryphal, but apparently chemical warfare was almost initiated as a result of German interceptions of American signals, ordering vast quantities of gas, of course, petroleum, to North Africa. A fascinating species of friction quite popular in the current era is something called asymmetrical warfare. In asymmetrical warfare, the two sides played by different rules, which often lends a remarkable uncertainty to the conflict, whose outcome would otherwise be clear. For example, there's Schmidt. I knew this guy was coming up. For example, in extreme cases of asymmetrical warfare, one side has to obey rules that are essentially those of the political department, whereas the other is almost perfectly laissez-faire. Wait a minute. For example, in the case of asymmetrical warfare, only one side obeys rules that are essentially those of... Oh, right. That's a bad way to talk about it. I mean, they're not playing by the same rules. They'll just say that, right, Logos?
Yeah.
A fellow by the name of Carl Schmidt, whose main claim to fame is that he was NS, wrote an interesting, though a frustrating essay called The Theory of the Partisan, inflicted on the world in 1962. This piece is full of bizarre Teutonic mysticism. You can probably take the boy out of Prussia, but you can't take Prussia out of the boy, and not really readable as such. But it is a peek at the modern era from a very non-modern perspective. Such things may not interest others, but for some reason they always fascinate me. One of Schmidt's concepts, which he attributes to the far more obscure Rolf Schroeder's, is the interested third party. The interested third party is basically whoever that is keeping your asymmetrical partisan war asymmetric. In other words, it is the political ally of the weaker, laissez-faire force, which ensures that its escalations are not rewarded with corresponding provocations, which would nullify the advantages they provide. Okay, so granted, he's quoting Schmidt here, not himself. In this case, I agree. So we can think of Vietnam, right? The Soviet Union was the interested third party, which meant that Vietnam could fight a total war and the United States could not. And furthermore, given the other aspect is not just the interested third party, it's also the idea of power differential. Vietnam was much weaker than the United States. So Vietnam fighting a total war with mass conscription and everything else could be theoretically justified diplomatically. But the United States could not, because it's just, the 800-pound gorilla in the room. This is such a sensitive topic. Notice that I'm not mentioning any examples. Not that I fear the subject, but it deserves its own post. That even the word ally is contentious. 2022, the DR today, it still is contentious. When most people think of an alliance, they think of two sides openly and knowingly cooperating to implement one vision of a result. Like the US and Britain in World War II, where two sides agreeing on a limited set of interests, like US and Russia in World War II. As Churchill said in 1941, if Mustache Man invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. However, as long as the actions of two parties advance each other's interests, they can be considered allies, even if their philosophies of the world are so utterly opposite that they cannot afford the luxury of any such favorable reference. The enemy of your enemy is your friend. No, Logos, the enemy of my enemy is my enemy's enemy, right?
Yeah, listen to base Jack Sparrow. He knows the truth.
And the same goes for the political opponent of your enemy, the enemy of your political enemy, political opponent, etc., etc. Perhaps we can venture a neologism and define this kind of hands-off alliance as para-alliance. Partners in a para-alliance will often cooperate quite consciously without any institutional realization that their success is due to their odd bedfellow. Another flavor of fiction is, of course, crime. The distinguishing feature of crime is that it has no vision of establishing a monopoly of power, unlike politics and war. It does not aspire to create a new status quo. Wait, of course it does. When some guys fighting on the east side of Chicago, the Irish and the Italians, you don't think that they claim that street corner exclusively for themselves, Logos?
Right. I mean, yeah, gang warfare in general is like that. The mafia, there's all sorts of crime like that.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, create a new status quo in which it is the dominant power. Instead, it is opportunistic and local. However, it is quite good at reappropriating vehicles, livestock, and other movables. Again, there are no clear lines between any two forms of friction, and crime is often indistinguishable from guerrilla warfare. Ooh, wow, man, this is just getting ridiculous. Right, Logos, because the mafia ambushes U.S. Marines on patrol like the VC did in Vietnam.
Yep.
Notice the VC uses mines, the mafia doesn't. There's a difference here, okay? There's a
Hmm.
difference here. Many criminals in many societies have thought of themselves as quasi-warriors. In an ideal society, all crime would be committed by sociopaths, people with no objective theory of right and wrong, but this has seldom been the case. When crime is motivated by political aspirations, let's call it paracrime. As with its cousin, asymmetrical warfare, paracrime generally cannot exist without an interested third party, which shields it from the repressive, escalating responsibilities that its political opponents would otherwise inflict. This situation bears some resemblance to what the late Sam Francis described as anarcho-tyranny, although I'm not sure Francis had a very clear conception of the forces that create and stabilize the species of para-alliance. Although I share his admiration for James Burnham and am sympathetic to many of his diagnoses, I find few of any of Francis's prescriptions to be of any use. Okay, so I'm going to try to make a prediction here and we'll see what he does. I think what Moldbug is going to say is in order to create a society without friction, we need to remove interested third parties, which means we just have to have an all-powerful state. Leviathan.
Yep. That's what I think.
That's where I think he's going. We'll see. Finally, the last important form of friction is pure tyranny, that is, the repressive government in the vein of Stalin, Mao, Kim Jong-il, and NS. This is sometimes called totalitarian government, though I think that term, strictly on the basis of its linguistic roots, should be extended to any state which exercises legislative omnipotence, or omnipotence with a few carved out exceptions, as with the Bill of Rights. Of course, no possible state can be omnipotent in its exercise of power. So, what does this even mean, Logos?
No idea. This has been a perennial problem.
Perennial problem. Okay. Tyranny is often misunderstood, which is not surprising, as few of us have lived in tyrannical states. Even the Soviet Union of Khrushchev and Brezhnev is far closer to present-day Western forms of government than to the murderous systems of Stalin. A common error made, for example, by Ayn Rand, is to identify tyranny and monarchy, which in fact are quite unrelated political forms. All they share is the coincidence of personal rule. We may not all know it, but we'd almost all rather live in the autocratic and absolutist Tsars than under Stalin. Well, that's just by degree. I mean, that's like saying, I'd rather have a little bit of poison than a lot of poison.
Right. Also, it just seems to me that all tyrannies are monarchies, even if not all monarchies are tyrannies. So to say they're unrelated is silly if one's a strict subset of the other one.
Right. In my opinion, tyranny is best seen as the sort of static civil war. The tyrant's office differs from the monarch's in that the latter's legitimacy is assured by law, whereas the former's is a matter of personal power and prestige. Every servant of a tyrant is a potential usurper. The military tyranny of the late Roman Empire, in which no emperor was safe from his own bodyguard, is an excellent example. Okay, I think I know where this is going with this now. He's not only going to say you need to have a single undivided political rule, but because there is some sort of implied legitimacy of the king, because he's either a god or rules in the name of the gods, then we can remove interested third parties, and we don't need to have the war of all against all. But this is clearly delusional. How do you explain the 19th century and all the monarchies that were overthrown?
Well, the other problem too is never mind the stability question, which we've talked about with Van Argel. He just said that the security force isn't supposed to be asking those kinds of questions.
Yes.
Right? Like we're supposed to have an information security disjunction. So no monarch can think that they're God if they control the security force, because that violates the separation of information and state thing that he was getting at a couple articles back. So the only way monarchies would use to secure their rule, he said they shouldn't do. So what does he want exactly?
Well, I don't know, because how else would a monarchy secure rule without direct application of violence? would be to claim that they either A, are God or represent the gods.
I mean, the only thing I can see him doing here is saying something like, well, there has to be like a full document that names like the full line of succession to the throne. So if, say, a bodyguard kills the emperor because they want to be emperor, then that won't work because the next person on the document will be the emperor. But like the problem is, what if somebody in line for the throne hires a bodyguard to kill the emperor because they're in line for succession? I'm sure that's never happened before in history, has it, Todd?
No, that's never happened, Logos. What are you talking about?
So what does he expect to happen? This just seems like an impossible to solve problem, given that emperors, shocker, I'm about to blow everybody's mind, they're not invincible, omnipotent, finargal beings. Crazy.
I mean, Logos, this is just so petulant and childish. I still can't understand how this gained traction.
Yep.
Tyrants may repress their subjects out of sadism, and it's certainly easy for them to acquire this taste, but they also do so out of necessity, because if they relax their grip for a minute, they will be overthrown. Okay? Schrodinger's chimp. Stalin had excellent rational reasons for purging the old Bolsheviks. That's doubtful. As Mustache Man did for purging the SA. A tyrant cannot allow any center of opposition to develop. Tyranny, in other words, is essentially informal and unstable, at least in the modern era. That tends to evolve into juntas. No, that's a different definition of informal, Logos. The definition of informal was we weren't sure who was in charge.
Exactly.
We know who's in charge with Papa Stalin. This is just... Keep going. At least in the modern era, they tend to evolve into juntas, which tend to evolve into oligarchies, which tend to evolve into democracies. The paths of Russia and China after communism are good examples. Wait, China after communism, Logos. So China in 2007 wasn't communist. That's news to me.
Yep.
That's real news to me. Wow. Hot take from Moldbug. Which of these steps, legitimacy and internal security, increases and the state becomes stronger and harder to overthrow unless Gaza is your ideal of fun? A strong and secure state is a good thing. Perhaps the principal error of modern libertarians is their failure to distinguish between weak government and small government. My ideal government is extremely small, extremely efficient, and extremely strong. Its authority cannot be challenged. Good luck with that. It doesn't repress its citizens. Interesting. Not because it's physically incapable of repression, but because repression is far from being in its interests, directly opposite to them. But this too is in a separate post. In future posts, I'll look more at some of these forms of friction and ways to resolve them. Okay, so let's go back to informal here. How it's, the shifting definitions. The problem with informal structures, as we mentioned in the very first essay we read, was that we weren't sure who was in charge. With Stalin, we know. Now he's like, well, maybe Stalin could be overthrown in a coup, so we don't really know. But that would be the same with a monarchy. And in fact, far more monarchs were killed on the throne than dictators. So by Moldbug's standard, there was a point when the Byzantine Empire where something like 20 emperors died unnatural deaths within a century. It's crazy. Who's more stable, that or Stalin?
Exactly. Yep.
One thing I want to read quickly. We got a super chat here. The Anreeb for £5, I think, pounds. Thank you very much. Moldbug is like Ian from Timcast, a higher social class, better reading history with too many movies, and slightly less LSD brain damage. I know a little bit about Ian. I don't think Ian is quite as obnoxious and patently idiotic as Moldbug. He's more a little slow on the uptake. Do you have anything to say about that, Logos?
I don't know who Ian is very well, so I can't comment.
All right. So next, wait, gotta go down here. Moderation. June 20th, 2007. The Magic Johnson, a triple-double invented by my office mate Mark Fox, is the monster edged of the map. Crabs with wings. This is a bad poetry. I'll skip it. Okay. So what we're going to do real quick, everybody, is take a quick restroom break for about 3 minutes, and then we'll be back. All right, everybody, I'm going to engage with the chat until Logos gets back. I see Minoan, you've said, might I suggest a short video or tune during intermission? People think you're muted or frozen. It's actually a good point. I'll have to figure out how to do that. But, yeah, letting people know that I'm muted is good. Okay, Logos is back now. Why conservatives never quite catch the boat? Well, Logos, I can just tell you in one sentence. It's not profitable to catch the boat. That's it. But we'll see what Moldbug says. In a sad effort to boost my sagging status, only 12 people visited UR last week. 7 of them were commentators, and the other 5 were me. I've decided to begin attacking other bloggers. I thought I'd start with one of the wisest and most perceptive conservatives around, Lawrence Astor, and one of his excellent frequent correspondents, Thucydides. Thucydides writes, and apropos of nothing, the sheer brain power and Astor's salon is enough to carbonize an ox, especially if the ox is pro-immigration. It occurs to me that one reason most liberals refuse to recognize the problem of illegal or excessive legal immigration, even though some of the effects, for example, driving down wages for the lowest earners, should attract their concern, is that their utopianism prevents them from acknowledging that we have a culture worth preserving. Their dreams are of some universal rationalistic civilization in which human difference will effervesce by comparison, to which our existing culture seems lacking. They gain an elitist self-satisfaction on the cheap by positioning themselves as critics of what actually exists. It is unjust, discriminatory, racist, etc. The minute they would acknowledge that we do have a culture, that whatever its flaws compare favorably to most others in the world, that we do have things to be thankful for, that we have a reason for gratitude, they are out of business as superior critics and morally worthy people who imagine a better world. Since their whole sense of identity is bound up in this posture, they cannot for a minute think of abandoning it, even when it clashes with their own goals. Being unable to acknowledge that there is anything worth preserving about our culture, their universalism takes complete control, since all people are the same in all places and times, regardless of their particular historic inheritances. Any sort of division or border, it seems, is in need of rational justification, and they, given their assumptions, cannot find one. Astor replies, very well put. They cannot ever allow themselves to be in the position of defending our particular culture, because then they would not be superior to all cultures. In my opinion, it's not well put at all. Its logic is almost right, but it's not quite right. Who, for example, is we? What is our culture? Why should subjects of particular political entity have anything particular in common? What is the difference between these set and the set, say, of all people whose names start with the letter A, or the set of all people with brown hair? Not that I am a universalist, a word I like a lot, although Brahmin idealist, progressive idealist, ultra-Calvinist, or any other names I may invent, or others may submit in UR's ongoing name, that Death Star contest whose prize is, as usual, a bottle of Lafrague. The reference is the same thing Astor means when he says liberal, a word I dislike intensely. No, Logos. It's absolutely not the same thing Astor means by liberal, because what Astor means by liberal is presumably something actually like a real term, unlike this word salad of goop.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Au contraire, I recognize that this section of North America ruled by the government in Washington, D.C. is very different both in geography and population from, say, the section of West Africa ruled by the government in Abuja. In fact, I feel as if I'd have a great deal of trouble assimilating into any other of the many cultures in Nigeria, and I see no reason to assume the converse would be any different. But the U.S. too has many cultures. What do Thucydides and Astor even mean by culture? I'm really not sure. I prefer to think of America's major social castes and divisions as castes. Here's my taxonomy. Here's my analysis of the conflicts. Well, that's just Moldbug being Moldbug. I mean, of course we know what these two guys mean by culture. They mean broadly Western culture and more narrowly American culture. What we read from Thucydides sounds an awful lot like what, say, a Jordan Peterson or somebody from the Daily Wire who might say, well, America has its problems, but we ended slavery. Nobody else ended slavery. It's literally that kind of argument just like 15 years ago. And we know what those people mean. There's nothing unambiguous about that, is there, Logos?
No, and also, like, if you want a more exact definition, here's my first attempt. We'll see how good it goes. He mentioned castes and conflicts, right? Well, what if a culture is just a meta set of rules by which people of the different castes? So, like, Brahmins have things they have to do to keep social favor with Brahmins. So there is an interculture of Brahmins, right? You can be ejected from the club if you say the wrong thing in intellectual circles. Also, the more WASP-oriented caste, right? They have certain rules that you have to follow: dress, speaking, whatever. Fine. But there is a broader these people don't live alone on islands. They interact with each other in society. And so far, there are ways in which society allows them to act toward one another, and ways society doesn't allow them to act toward one another. So if you think about the rules of engagement between castes, not just within castes, the rules of engagement between castes would form the broader culture these people seem to be alluding to. So in some countries, you can, the people in power can do certain things to intellectuals they don't like. Here in America, they can't. So our cultural relation between castes is different here than there. I mean, this doesn't seem hard.
Well, it's not hard. And I actually was thinking about something that's related to this, and I want to go on a little bit of a rant here, is when we talk about culture and we play these games about what is a culture, like we all intuitively know what a culture is, what a nation is, and whether you're a libertarian or a progressive. So like Moldbug's a libertarian. He's just being coy. What this really means, in fact, is something you and I have talked about, Logos. If we view people as just these self-interested individuals, or egalitarian, pod people, then what that really means is the intelligent people that live in rooted communities leaving the rest of us stuck in places like the Rust Belt, the Black Belt, the Midwest, because we've dissolved this intermediate structure that would otherwise tether these intelligent, competent people to their own in order to help them navigate life and live a happy, fulfilled existence. But either way, they're going to get hoovered up. And this acid process of, oh, it's a culture, bro. It's just a part of that.
Right.
And it really pisses me off. Let's see. Right. Surely if one attempts to construct some description which combines all these castes, Brahmin, Liberal Democrat, Dalit, Ghetto Democrat, Hell Out, Labor Democrat, Optimate, Old School. Oh yeah, Optimate. You be the Puritans, Logos, the WASPs. So somehow they're simultaneously the victims and the bad guys here. Well, and Vicia, middle-class American Republican. You get mixed nuts with the maraschino cherries and a calamari. If this is somehow a single culture or description, I doubt could be defended with any conceivable definition of the word. Its main common denominators are McDonald's, public schools, and CNN. Pound, Hamsun, and Klein. Come back, we miss you, all is forgiven. In fact, when you look at the actual issue Thucydides is concerned about, but using my framework rather than his, you see, in my opinion, a very clear and intelligible pattern. The Brahmins, Universalists, ultra-Calvinists, etc., do not hate our culture at all. They have a very distinct culture of their own with a family tree that spends a remarkable amount of time in Massachusetts, upstate New York. Excellent and only mildly neo-unionist picture of the Civil War, the destructive war. He mentions a foreign traveler in 1864 who asked some random American to explain the war. It's the conquest of America by Massachusetts was the answer. Massachusetts was, of course, later went on to conquer first Europe and then the entire planet. The news of these elites as of 2007 bears surprisingly coincidental resemblance to those held at Harvard in 1945, but I digress. No, the Brahmins love their own Brahmin culture, and they hate the cultures of their enemies, the Optimates and the Vaishyas. I mean, where does a bear poop? Not in the Vatican, that's for sure. As for Brahmin feelings on the elites and Helots, opinions are more complex. Orthodox ultra-Calvinists idolize Dalits and Helots, but most of them do not know any Dalits and converse with Helots only occasionally and in their professional capacity. They certainly do not want to live in the same neighborhoods as Dalits, although some daring ultra-Brahmin youth do use this as a social selection device, especially with Dalits of the Hispanic community who for some reason are less violent. The principle is much the same as that which leads young Satre Mawe warriors to torture themselves with Ebola ants. The decision to accept the various discomforts of living in a Dalit neighborhood is the rite of initiation into an exclusive social circle, though it is also, of course, tends to be cheaper, allowing our hipster to attend more assiduously to his various unproductive pursuits. But if Brahmins need to work up a lather of hate against Dalits and Helots, they probably could. However, this is not precisely useful. It is quite the contrary. And so instead, we see a lather of love. Again, we are not talking about the Pope doing his business in the woods here. The Dalit and Helot castes are wonderful allies for the Brahmins. First, they provide, of course, voters. If we counted just B versus OV votes, the OVs would win in a walkover. As a very rough proxy, the last president to win the white vote was Lyndon Johnson. See, I don't buy this at all, Logos, right? Because what he's saying is, or rather, if we look at like what would happen if only say white people voted, or only men voted. Like men are kind of left out of this conclusion. Men tend to be the enemy here because men are the ones that, if they were the only ones voting, wouldn't be voting for Brahmins.
Right.
Almost, if not quite as important, the high crime rates of both Dalits and Helots, if legal immigration isn't a crime, what is, make them such useful allies. The entire caste can be deployed as a crude but effective demo armies in the grand old leftist style. Here, for example, is a major presidential candidate deploying them rhetorically, at least as a direct threat in order to extract money. It would be really nice if all riots would be quiet riots, and it would be really nice if you could put your hands on your head and accompany me to the nearest ATM. In fact, the only reason the riots are quiet, this is pretty much non-existent, is that sometime around 1975, the black man started to get a little tired of being used as the white man's pawn. If I may indulge in a little blast of retro rhetoric, that has not aged well at all in light of 2020. Has it?
Well, he's saying that in the 1970s the riots got less quiet. So I mean, in 2020 the riots are still
less quiet. I thought he said they were getting more quiet.
No, they get less quiet because they're tired of being used as the white man's pawn. That's what he said.
Well, wait a minute. He says the only reason the riots are quiet.
That is pretty much non-existent. Huh.
That didn't age well at all.
That has to be a typo. What?
I know. Like, wait. It's like, huh? What? And again, around 1975, so we also have the LA riots of 92. Like, what is he talking about?
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't know. Okay, I have an idea. I think what he's saying is that he quoted Obama earlier as saying quiet riots. That was the last article, or 2 articles ago. And he's saying that what explains the Obama effect, I guess, is that around 1975 this happened. But then he says quiet riots are non-existent. So then what is he describing? It still falls apart. I'm just trying to, that was the best I could do.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, what is going on is simple. Brahmins don't really believe all cultures are equal. They believe their culture is superior, and they have a system of thought, multiculturalism, that contradicts all other systems of thought on the planet, past and present. Again, the Pope and the Bear, etc. All cultures are brutal, aggressive predators, and are positively, that Highlander style at the prospect of eliminating any of their competitors. Certainly the Brahmin culture, which as I've defined is the current heir to the American and Western European mainline Protestant tradition, is the leading contender in going strong. See, now this is interesting, right? So if they've replaced the Protestant tradition, then these people are Protestants, right? They're the 2 other groups we've mentioned. So I don't. Ultra-Calvinism is the descendants of the Puritans. No, it's not. This is stupid. This guy doesn't read American history. I have more to say on this in the future. Is an aggressive cultural predator that has evolved a cool new trick. It likes to partly reanimate or reinvent the corpses of its smaller and more decayed victims, as Aztlan reinvigorates the Aztecs, Kwanzaa, the Ashanti, or Ocean, the Celts, and they pretend they're real. Since there is actually no prospect at all of any actual revival of Aztec, Ashanti, or Celtic cultures, this is safe. And it demonstrates ultra-Calvinism's so-called tolerance. Come into my parlor, said the spider to the fly. And ultra-Calvinism is also tolerant to branches of other religions, which it has in fact taken over, such as Reform Judaism or moderate Islam. In fact, no more moderate of any modern faith could find any conceivable reason to raise his voice in any conversation with a randomly selected Unitarian, which, while it may not be entirely conclusive, is a pretty good evidence that they are actually devotees of the same religion. It's the old zombie maneuver. So we end up with a very simple and quite mundane exit the Pope, pursued by the Bear reason why the Brahmins are trying to augment the U.S. Helot population. Everyone always needs more allies, especially when your stagnant empire is crumbling. Of course, this is not always a conscious thought, but it doesn't need to be a conscious thought. It just needs to be adaptively successful. In other words, it just needs to work. And boy, it does. So again, I'd say Thucydides is not quite right. Perhaps he agrees with this logic. Perhaps he doesn't. If he finds this post, he's welcome to comment, but it's certainly not what he said and not quite right. Maybe almost right, but that's not quite right, is the difference between the ventilation shaft and the ventral asteroid plate. Okay, well, here's something that he's leaving out. And again, what's not being stated is always the most important thing. So let's go back to those Vaishyas. Where does the empire recruit soldiers? From the Vaisyas. They know they can't get rid of them entirely. And we saw this pivot again in the aughts, which was right in 2007. In fact, a lot of the most extreme elements of the woke culture didn't come around until after Obama. So he's, compared to what we're dealing with now, with the excessive elements of the woke, it's reversed, because now they need these chumps to go fight in Ukraine, and the fact that he just left that out seems to me very interesting.
Yep.
Why would you leave them out?
Probably because they're not. He's mostly concerned with cultural movers and shakers, the press, education, things like that. And these people, whatever else they do, some call them the silent majority, some call them all sorts of things, but they just tend to get on with day-to-day life, and so they're not really pawns in his big battle for the narrative of culture, whatever that is.
Well, I know that, but the Brahmins still have to use them as shock troops. They can't dispense with them entirely.
Right.
And that's what he doesn't. That's what he's not saying.
Mm-hmm.
While they may not like them, they may make fun of them, they still need them to fight their wars.
Yep.
Let's see, which may not matter at all if you just want to fire up a mob, but dissidents in the West today cannot win by firing up a mob. They can only win by convincing young, smart people who will otherwise be convinced by the numerous, extremely convincing official sources of information that they are constantly competing for access to their tender eyes and ears. Conservatives, if Washington could be conquered by peasants with pitchforks, don't you think it would have happened by now? Do you think there are more peasants with pitchforks or fewer than there were 10 years ago? Do you have any strategy for reversing this trend? If not, you're just wasting time and annoying the pig. In my opinion, it's not Larry Astor's words that can learn from, although these words are often remarkably cogent and well-informed, it is his actions. He may think in terms of a strain of American nationalism that hasn't been effective since Robert Taft was a little boy, but his blog tells a different story. Compare it to the National Review's Corner someday, and you'll see the difference. Astor's random emailers, he hand moderates everything and only accepts comments via email, are much smarter and better formed than most of the NRO pros. I mean, again, well, okay, what's not being mentioned here? He says, do you think there are more peasants with pitchforks or fewer than there were 10 years ago? You know, do you think it would have already happened by now? Well, no, Moldbug, because it's obvious. Storming Washington is not profitable. I don't know how many times we have to drill this into people's heads. Conservatives don't win because winning isn't profitable. And so, no, we wouldn't expect conservatives to storm the White House even if they outnumbered the security guards, because it's not profitable to do so.
Yep.
Astor is collecting the smartest people around, so why does he keep pursuing rhetorical strategies that appear calculated only to rally people who already support his movement, rather than strategies designed to compete with and defeat ultra-Calvinism's own reproductive system? Well, that's not interesting, Logos. Their own reproductive system. You mean the university? He didn't mention that either, Logos.
Yep.
That's also interesting.
Well, what I find interesting is, does Moldbug think that anything he's saying is going to compete with these in any sort of way? I mean, most people don't know who Moldbug is that I've talked to. But when I try to explain to them any of his ideas, they recoil in terror because it sounds like every dystopian movie they've ever seen. So nothing Moldbug's doing here sounds like it's going to do any better.
Fair enough. Astor is collecting the smartest people around, so why does he keep pursuing rhetorical strategies that appear calculated only to rally people who already support his movement, Well, wait. Well, at least he's doing that. Moldbug is trying to offend everybody, including his own supporters. Rather than strategies to design to compete with and defeat ultra-Calvinism's own Man, Logos, I tell you, I'm sold. This whole thing is going to compete with the ultra-Calvinist university system to win. You watch, Logos, you watch.
Oh, yeah.
Capturing the cream of their youth and turning them into the dark side of the force. Excuse me. I mean, away from the dark side, of course. Oh, well, what delusional fantasy is this? Capturing the Biden kids, capturing the Clinton kids, capturing the Bush kids. Those are the people he's talking about. What is he smoking? That's not going to happen. If there is one general weakness in the conservative strategy, it strikes me as this unwillingness to admit that liberalism is actually mainline Protestantism, which is actually Christianity. No, Moldbug.
No.
The weakness is conservatives won't win because it's not profitable to win.
Right. I mean, the one thing that Moldbug didn't seem to expand on here that they should have is that immigration is good for business. And circa 2007, conservatism was still the Chamber of Commerce party.
Yeah. Well, okay, this is what's interesting, right, Logos? I think this is where the non-Christian, anti-Christian right gets founded. A lot of they may not make exactly the same arguments as Moldbug here, but a lot of what they say, if you hear them now, sounds very much like Moldbug. It's you weak, soft-hearted Christians that hold us back from doing the dirty, necessary work of winning this fight. Does that
Exactly. Yeah.
Right?
I hear that a lot.
Well, it's from Moldbug, right? I think this is 2007. This is like really early ground floor level. I think it's coming from Moldbug
And Nietzsche.
Yes, and Nietzsche, but then you have to ask who popularized all this stuff. Partly it was Moldbug, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Right, because Moldbug is the conduit for a lot of ideas. Obviously, yes, it is Nietzsche, but whether or not it obeys any specific detail of Christian or Protestant doctrine, such as the validity of the Holy Trinity, the existence of God, the divinity of Jesus, the predestination of the elect, etc., 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 is entirely irrelevant. Oh, well, isn't that convenient? That's very relevant, Moldbug, very relevant. We are talking about a continuous cultural tradition whose superficial features constantly mutate. Wait, how can you have a continuous cultural tradition with its, I'm sorry, they're only superficial features mutating, of course. That's ridiculous. There's nothing in common between Biden, who is an Irish Catholic, and the Puritans. WTF, Logos, what is this?
How interesting is it, right, that you can define a Brahmin culture despite all their rotating power blocks, intellectual fads, all sorts of other things going on, and yet you can call that a consistent culture. But yet a broader culture that's trying to contain all the different castes, their rules of engagement, and all that stuff in society, that's not a culture at all. Cultures only happen within castes, even when they don't.
Even when they don't. Well, it's a waste of time to generate antibodies to metaphysical doctrines. I will say more about that in a bit. Of course, if you're a Christian, you don't believe these features are superficial. But doesn't that make a nice trap? Neither side can call a spade a spade. The ultra-Calvinist needs to hide the fact that they are spades, and the conservatives, since they believe that only conservative spades or true spades, refuse to bestow upon their enemies the prized status of spadefulness. No, it's profitability. Moving on. Whereas if you can make it past this trap, you are rewarded with an enormous store of clear and easy to apply metaphors for religious persecution, an entire quotidian and extremely common phenomenon which everyone understands. For example, if ultra-Calvinists are Christians, political correctness is religious orthodoxy. Where have we seen this before? Perhaps in Massachusetts, or in Italy, or in the Church of England, but I don't know. It's just, who knows? I mean, to be fair, though, Moldbug does take a lot of pot shots at Catholics. So to be fair, he doesn't do that. And it's surprising that so many Catholics like Moldbug. I mean, is it in any surprise that Ivy League schools are acting in effect as ultra-Calvinist seminaries? Isn't that exactly what they were founded as? No. No, because Yale, the oldest college in the United States, was, well, okay, I think there was a call. I think, no, yeah, the United States was founded to produce Puritan seminarians. That's not Joe Biden. That's not the Bushes. That's not the Clintons. What are you talking about? This is insane.
Yeah, it is.
And what are multiculturalism and diversity but religious tests for office? I don't know of anything of that sort in history. Maybe in Nepal. Nah. In fact, religious conservatives whose Christianity is generally of the non-mainline sort, although not every single one of them is an actual practicing snake handler, have basically taken over the traditional role of Catholics in the British political system. What? That's bizarre, because like the Catholics, see, okay, the role of the Catholics in the British political system after Protestantism was established was a minority that was kept as far away from any power as possible. And this is really important because in 1688, with the Glorious Revolution, there was a constitution that was passed, I think a year later, which talked about the standing army and the right to bear arms. Catholics were not given the right to bear arms. Guess who is? The Viceroys. And guess what the Viceroys do? They go fight overseas for the empire. Now, Catholics weren't doing that in the British political system. It was the Scots. I can't, Lois, I can't. This just, it's too much. I can't do this.
Sounds painful. Sorry, bro.
It is. This is what happens when you put your brain in a blender.
Why do we do this to ourselves, Todd?
It's for the greater good. It's for the greater good.
If you say so.
For example, Brahmins are all in a tizzy that the Justice Department under Bush has hired 8 lawyers from conservative law schools, Ave Maria and Regent. Of course, in the same period, it has hired 63 from Harvard and Yale, but once the camel's nose is in the tent, etc., it invites contamination. You can't just let your institutions be captured like that, and the New York Times is very wise to object. I mean, they should know, shouldn't they? And this is why conservatives never quite catch the boat. They do not want to admit that what they are fighting is in fact a very old religious war in which their side holds and has always held the losing hand. Conservatives cannot admit that conservatism is futile because then they'd have nothing to do. No man will willingly abolish his own occupation. No, this isn't a very old religious war. This is delusional fantasy land. What this is the petite bourgeoisie, the Viceroys, versus the bourgeoisie, the Brahmins. It's literally that simple. And this is why you and I logo say the petite bourgeoisie always loses, because either the hot bourgeoisie wins or the revolutionaries win.
Yep.
Okay, so conservative political activists too do good services or enemy pawns because the only winning political strategies I can imagine for conservatives, at least in the near term, involving things like boycotting elections. Since conservatives believe in America and in democracy, they will never do this. Therefore, they lose, and they will be certain to lose. Well, it's not entirely clear how boycotting elections would work, because then from Moldbug's point of view, you would just be giving the enemy all the territory, right? Isn't that what Moldbug would say?
Sorry, I missed that last question. Say that again.
I don't understand how, from Moldbug's position, boycotting elections would work, because all that does is just cede everything to the enemy.
Well, I think what Moldbug is trying to say, this again goes to formalism, right? So what Moldbug is saying, this goes back to the whole spade analogy, where the left is not calling themselves Christians, and the right's happy to not call them Christians, and so there's this air of resistance, so to speak, between the two. The right formally boycotting elections would be to admit formally that the left control the institutions of power. You can't blame the Republicans for anything. We're not even voting anymore. So everything that happens is on your shoulders. So it'd be one way of enacting a formalist strategy is to force the left to be in charge because their opposition has abdicated all power. And therefore the left, when the system goes to hell, the left can't blame the conservatives for anything because they didn't even take power to try to stop them.
Right. Given also, if we're going to take the religious war analogy, again, I don't, but let's say that, because I think there's a better way to explain this struggle, but let's take Moldbug's analogy. Supreme Court. Those that are Christian are all Catholic. New York, run by Catholics. New England. Massachusetts, 2/3 Catholics. If it's any religious war, it's the old war of the Catholic Church against everybody else. That's what the religious war would be if it were a religious war.
Seems that way, doesn't it?
I know. Isn't it funny how ultra-Calvinist Puritans are Catholic?
It is. I mean, I guess the Catholics didn't do anything. I mean,
The caste-rated pseudo-opposition is of enormous use to the ultra-Calvinist blue government. I'm just going to say ultra-papist now, and now we have a better idea of what Moldbug's talking about. It distinguishes the essentially one-party nature of the polygon, the vast majority of whose servants are Democrats, and whose bizarre idea of apolitical or post-partisan government would otherwise not withstand 2 chimpanzee seconds of mental cogitation. Furthermore, the conservative movement is remarkably effective as a scare puppet. The American political system consciously promotes the most idiotic, backward, and ridiculous conservatives it can find. Every year, mainstream American conservatives are stupider, more venal, and more crass. The gradient from Eric Van Kunen-Ledin and Albert J. Nock to Jonah Goldberg and John Podhoretz, let alone to Michael Savage or Ann Coulter, is simply pathetic. Again, this is not somebody's plot. It is not a conscious design. It is an adaptive pattern whose beneficiary is quite obvious.
okay, I gotta stop right there. It is a conscious design. It is a
Yeah,
conscious
it
design.
is. It
The
is.
Clintons pioneered this strategy in the 90s. It's called triangulation, right? So what they do is Democrats will raise a bunch of money to fund the most conservative out there people they can find in the primaries. And then if they can get them to outfund their opponents and get them to the center stage in elections, the Democrats can say, "Whoa, look how scary this person is that won their primary. We can't. We have to. You know, democracy is at stake. We have to like dismantle this Republican terrifying thing that we funded to get here," which incidentally happened in the 2022 election as well. Hillary Clinton called it the Pied Piper strategy in 2016. This is absolutely a conscious strategy, 100%.
Yeah, no argument there. Stupid conservative foreign policies are wonderfully useful as well. The war in Iraq has been the greatest boon to the Polygon since the Vietnam War, in fact. Gee, isn't it funny how that works? Well, but it's not a conservative foreign policy because, again, a lot of these it was, but it wasn't solely. I mean, again, there's a lot of bipartisan support from the Democrats. Hillary Clinton and many others supported the war in Iraq. So, I mean, again, the Brahmins wanted that war. There's no, there's no ambiguity about that. There is no exit strategy for conservatives, which does not involve disassociating themselves completely from the failed Republican Party and successfully communicating with younger Brahmins who are willing to question the tenets of the rapidly ossifying ultra-Calvinist cult and the rule of the vast moribund Brezhnevite institutions which contain and transmit it. Okay. I've been saying A for years. I don't know what the heck he's smoking to say B. You are not going to ever convince young Brahmins to jump ship. That's not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, that's not even a conservative strategy at this point. It's like a left-wing strategy. What he's talking about is now the Peter Boghossian strategy of trying to, from within the left, bring the left kind of more toward the center or the right or something like that. But it's certainly not a strategy that conservatives were going to employ and even now aren't employing. The conservative strategy now is to cut off the Brahmin pipeline and try to get more young kids into trades or attack student loans to make it like more financially difficult for young people to go to college and things of that nature. Um, and so they're trying to attack the pipeline itself, which it's not it's in their interest to do so at this point, I suppose. Um, and so yeah, I don't know what to say about that.
Yeah, well, I think for you and I, you speak for both of us when, with regards to Moldbug in general, there's not much more to say about that. Moreover, any such conversation has to involve you converting them rather than them converting you, something by no means guaranteed with your average South Park conservative. And no, you are not going to convince them to handle snakes or speak in tongues. Isn't that funny? Isn't that funny? He's doing the same thing he criticized the Democrats for doing, picking out and highlighting the most silly conservatives. Makes you wonder what side he's on, huh, Logos?
Well, also, I thought the Brahmins were the neo-Christians to begin with, or the proto-Christians, or the whatever. Shouldn't the Brahmins be trying to convince the conservatives to do their rendition of speaking in tongues and handling snakes? Like, who's actually doing the religious converting here? He just got done saying that it was the Democrats that were the religious ones. I don't understand any of
More
this.
religious. I know. I know. Focus on the basic fact that while they may think they're rebels, they're actually loyal servants of a theocratic one-party state, and you might even get somewhere. Okay. Let's just tie this all up again. One sentence. Conservatives will never catch the boat because catching the boat is not profitable. Done. Whatever this Moldbug vomit was, I have no idea.
Yep.
Oh boy. Neo-Catholicism. What the heck? This is so stupid. June 22nd, 2007. I know, Logos. I'm taking one for the team with these ones. If by any chance you read this blog just for the articles, it's my duty to inform you that you are missing out on most of the fun. UR may not be the smartest blog on the net, but it certainly has the smartest commentators. This is probably just because it's new and the Yahoos haven't arrived yet, but it remains wondrous to me. At some point, I may slacken the flow of verbiage so that old decisions stay fresh longer. I feel it's important, since UR is a new blog, to maintain a pretty brutal tempo so that the site doesn't seem inviting to the wrong kind of reader. Hopefully, at some point, there will be a critical mass of disgruntled speed-reading malcontents who can discipline their own ranks. There were a couple of comments on my original ultra-Calvinism post that I didn't get a chance to respond to. Rather than post into a long dead thread, I thought I'd bring them out here. Well, if he's going to be so cool and hip, why didn't he just say, I don't want to necro the thread? Wouldn't that have been the cool hip thing to say at this point, Logos?
I don't know what internet lingo was like in 2007. I couldn't tell you.
First commentator extraordinary, Michael, who regularly exposes the superficial threads of my flimsy autodidactic pseudo-erudition. Michael points out that given that most of us think of the essence of Calvinism as predestination, the doctrine that God, who knows all things, knows which of us will or will not be saved, describing progressive idealists who are universalists in the strict Christian sense, they believe all will be saved. Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's total nonsense. As ultra-Calvinist is pretty strange. And indeed, I'm bending the usual meaning a little here. A little, you've broken the meaning and thrown it in the trash can.
A little?
The reason why I think I can get away with this is simple. If you define Calvinism in Michael's way, Calvinism is pretty much as dead as Mithranism. Whoa!
What? No!
That's insane. Neo-Calvinism is on a tear right now, Logos.
Has been for a while. Even in 2007, it was still fairly popular.
Yeah, well, Neo-Calvinism was organized around the Theonomy movement, which it's grown,
Mm-hmm.
Is there really anyone in the world, anyone in the world in 2007 who is seriously concerned with the Son of the Lord? Yes, his name was Doug Wilson. He was writing in 2007 and POing the Brahmins quite a lot. He freaking debated Christopher Hitchens. Let me look up what year this happened. Hitchens, Wilson debate. He's apparently familiar with Wilson, or Hitchens rather. Okay, so the debate was 2008, but Wilson had been writing for over a decade. So this is just painfully Moldbug being stupid again. Neo-Calvinism, and again, degree of separation. Doug Wilson is responding to Hitchens. The actual showdown debate was a year later than this. But presumably Hitchens wouldn't have had the debate if he wasn't already in a discussion with Doug Wilson. This is just completely... I can't even, Logos. I can't.
Well, the other thing, too, is it's like, out of all the ways you could have characterized the structural way you wanted to do it, why would you have to bend meanings to pick out this thing? Why couldn't you have just used, like, congregationalism? That's not a particular theological screed. It's just a statement on church authority. It would have done the job just fine without having to bend words. But the meta critique here is it just seems that this guy can't seem to make any point without bending a whole bunch of words until you don't really know what you're talking about. And that seems to be a defense mechanism, right? Because if you find some hole in what he's talking about, he can always say, well, I bent the words a little. You didn't really fully understand what I was trying to get at. It's like, yeah, dummy, I didn't understand what you're trying to get at because you keep bending the words aside from their original usage. So how could I?
Right. So I am looking up. Yeah, never mind. No, Doug Wilson is one of those Calvinist right-wing guys that is a gadfly to the Brahmins. I mean, they squawk about him all the time. So all Moldbug would have had to do is not look very hard to find the writings of Doug Wilson. Let's see. who has any strong opinions at all on the subjects of unconditional election, total depravity, the perseverance of the saints, limited atonement, or irresistible grace, the 5 points of Orthodox Calvinism? I mean, Logos, I was alive in the aughts. All they talked about was the theocratic takeover, the theocracy, and they point to these guys like Rushdoony. How does he not know this?
Well, the other thing too is like, well, does anyone have opinions on these things? Yeah, I would suppose non-Calvinists have opinions on these things. This is beside the point. I don't think I really care about the opinions on these theological questions. What I care about is how these theological questions relate to government. That seems to be the issue here. If we're trying to dictate what kinds of Christian traditions do what with government, I don't have to know about the finer points of predestination. If statistically what I do see is the people who believe in predestination are like heavily conservative and not the Brahmins that this guy's telling us they are.
That too. Well, actually, they do have opinions about one of these, irresistible grace. This is the general path of doctrinal evolution. Unused organs atrophy, and the whole machine becomes stripped down like a white cavefish that shed their eyes. That's a take from David Stove in his book, Darwin as Fairy Tales. He mentions David Stove earlier in here, and Stove is definitely a good author to read. He calls Richard Dawkins a genetic Calvinist. But that's not related to politics. Jefferson dumped the Trinity, Emerson relieved us of hell, and so on down to Harvey Cox in a secular theology. If you think secular is synonymous with atheistic, the full horror of the situation is not yet clear to you. When Michael, along with admittedly most educated people, equates Calvinism with predestination, aka unconditional election, he is applying what in an older post I call nominalist classification strategy. That is, he is taking Calvinist theology at face value. Well, why wouldn't you, Logos?
Well, I mean, it's not clear that's a nominalist classification, because a nominalist classification would just be like what we call things, right? And so you could take a different view of classification in his degrees of classification by looking at the relationship between Calvinism and politics, like we keep saying. And you could just make the relationship based on that. But what he's done instead is make this very superficial classification in that Calvinists tend to be more congregational, and some other Congregationalists, like Universalists, tend to be very left-leaning people, like in Massachusetts or whatever. Therefore, Calvinists have more in common with these Universalist types, which is just dumb. It's indefensible.
It's indefensible, right? Calvinism defines itself as the 5 points, so why shouldn't we respect this? Here's why. Because the result that the nominalist approach produces is that replicating prototype of a considerable political and cultural significance with known pathological tendencies has simply disappeared. It has become extinct. It's not extinct. In fact, Doug Wilson was a rising star at this time. A year later, he's going to debate Christopher Hitchens. This is completely insane. Plus, again, there was the whole bugbear about the theonomists and the rise of a Christian Taliban. Like, this was like at full steam right here. So, there's no need at all to worry about it. They are not the droids they're looking for. If we apply either the morphological or cladistic strategies, however, we begin to see a very different result. Well, okay, so hold on. If it doesn't exist, Logos, okay, he's wrong. But let's agree with him that it doesn't exist. Then why bother bringing it up?
Yeah, well, okay, I'm gonna blow your mind right now, Todd. You ready for this?
I'm ready for this.
Are you sure you're ready for this?
I am ready for this, Logos.
What did he just accuse the left of doing in the last stream? Or the last paper we just read?
Picking on the most crazy, extreme people that don't really have any influence and power. Yeah.
No. I'm going a different place with this.
Oh, well, then tell me, what's the other one?
Remember, he accused the left in their multicultural endeavors of picking up the ghosts and zombies of dead cultures and trying to puppeteer and reanimate them for their own ends.
Yeah. Oh.
If he's right and Calvinism is a dead culture, he's doing the exact same thing the left does. He's basically picked up the remains, reappropriated the vocabulary, and he's using that to puppeteer for his own meta-narrative.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's wow. No, yeah, that's it. If we apply either the morphological or cladistic strategies, however, we get a very different result. The replicator at once pops back into view. It is not dispirit at all. It has just mutated into ultra-Calvinism, that is the non-universalist Unitarianism, now itself extinct, which begat transcendentalism, which begat unionism, progressivism, and the ecumenical movement, which became the great super-Protestant establishment, so derided by the late, great flower children who conquered it and gave us multiculturalism, diversity. Well, remember earlier on in our streams, I made just that genealogical connection. So Moldbug admits that he knows this, that, these I guess you could say the quote descendants. But if we're going to use this game, then Lenin and communism was a result of Eastern Orthodoxy. Like, this is stupid. Like, why would anybody look at Eastern Orthodoxy and say, well, oh, that give us... No, you might say it gave us Lenin and Leninism in some other way, but not in the sort of like lineal genetic way, like it's a natural biological development from Eastern Orthodoxy. It's militant atheism. What are you talking about?
Right.
Not an unusual turn of events at all. Belief systems and languages evolve in much the same ways, and if you look at the historical gyrations of, say, English, the evolution from Calvinism to ultra-Calvinism seems positively straightforward and sedate. By the way, in the last article we read, he said that the conservatives were taking a position that would make them ridiculous. Well, if his goal is to sort of like say, hey, look, well, this gets back to, this ties into the future, right? Because he said to the OV crowd, oh, don't worry, man, I'm going to convert the Brahmins for you. Just let me do it. Well, that was the whole point of Elves versus Hobbits, which came out this year. And so he hasn't changed at all in 15 years his overall strategy. The real issue is he's the absurd one because his base is the Calvinists, the right-wing, the Protestants. The Protestants are the ones that vote Republican. The Protestants are the ones that are the petite bourgeoisie. And so he's literally attacking the Vaishyas. I just... that would be like the Brahmins attacking the minority cultures.
Basically, yeah.
And we use the adaptive method. The result is even more disturbing. First of all, this trick of dropping off the radar screen is very suspicious. In fact, as I pointed out in my post, ultra-Calvinism has extremely compelling reasons for not wanting to be known as either Christian or Protestant, because its pattern of intolerance are extremely ugly and familiar to anyone who can swallow any such taxonomy. Peter Hitchens has called it limey equivalent, the most intolerant faith to dominate Britain since the Reformation. If there was ever a general understanding that political correctness is merely a case of common or garden religious intolerance, its apologists would find their jocular habit of excusing it as a kind of intellectual rowdiness. Boys will be boys and so on no longer rolls so smoothly off the tongues, and its foes would find themselves infinitely better armed. But worse, the adaptive methods does not identify predestination as the salient invariant of Calvinism, nor does it focus on total depravity or irresistible grace. Instead, it notes that a shared feature of all prototypes in this line of descent, from Calvin to Emerson to Hillary Clinton, from Geneva to Cadwallader to the hot Asbury, has been the assiduous insistence on building God's kingdom on earth. Okay, now he's going to go to postmillennialism. Of course, this is what Eric Voegelin called immanentizing the eschaton. Doctrinally, it originates in a postmillennial interpretation of the Book of Revelation. If you disagree with this interpretation as many as you do, you might say, as Michael has, that this represents a rejection of Christianity in favor of Gnosticism. Okay, well, two things, right? Historic Reformed theology was amillennial. The Calvinists that he should have been aware of as of 2007, Doug Wilson and the Theonomists, were postmillennial. But that was considered a bit, by the already established sedate Calvinist institutions, that was considered a little outre, a little edgy. And this isn't Calvinist. I mean, Eusebius was postmillennial. He literally says the Roman Empire is going to last forever. It's fulfillment of divine prophecy. I mean, you might as well include Catholics and Orthodox in this too, which he does, because he says this is just Christianity, full stop. But it's not, because if all of this hinges on an interpretation of the Book of Revelation, most Christians aren't postmillennial. So this whole thing just falls apart.
Basically, it's just ultra-reductivist. He's trying to hide behind this morphological categorization, whatever. Basically, any belief you have that the world can be better than it is automatically makes you a Christian belief. Now, either you're going to have an authoritarian reason for having the belief, maybe you're a
Mhm.
type of Catholic or something, or you're not. And what he's going to do is he's going to pigeonhole you either way. So if you're not in a Christian sect, then you're just a hyper congregationalist. You're not going to let the church authority tell you, but you still have this Christian belief that the world could be better than it is. And so he's now going to classify you in this very, very convenient ultra-Calvinist proto-Christian, basically is what he's going to call you. Basically, he's making the net so big that nobody can fall out of it. But then the other problem too is if morality and the idea that there is a better idea the world could be, there's a way the world ought to be, is invariant under humans, like everybody's moral. See his nominalism essay, then it seems everybody's going to have that problem to some degree or other. So
Well,
are
he
we all
does.
Christians? So
Well, he
like,
does because he
yeah,
says that a better world would be a more formal world.
exactly. So it's formalism, his attempt to build God's kingdom on earth. This doesn't make any sense.
It's literally just a word salad of vomit. It doesn't mean anything.
Yep.
But again, this is nominalism. And again, he's not even using nominalism correctly. I remember a couple episodes back, we had that 5-part analysis. Nominalism is the denial of formal structures, which, he wants formalism. He should be a metaphysical realist. I mean, Logos, I can't do this right now.
Uh-huh.
And it's also focusing, as I've said many times, on metaphysical beliefs. By definition, metaphysical beliefs cannot be directly adaptive. That is, they cannot be themselves create an incentive to alter the real world in ways that improve the belief system's ability to transmit itself.
Why? That's a hell of a claim.
Wait, let's see this again. By definition, metaphysical beliefs cannot be directly adaptive. That is, they cannot be themselves create an incentive to alter the real. Yeah, that's just absurd. That's just by fiat. That's what all religions do, actually.
I mean, not even religion. Let's just take some. Here's a metaphysical thesis. Nominalism, like the real kind of nominalism, is a metaphysical belief, right? So nominalism cannot by itself create an incentive to alter the real world in ways that improve the belief system's ability to transmit itself. Are you serious? Do people not believe that there's no incentive for the whole, I don't know, let's just take something, math is invented, or math is just a language, or math is just whatever you want crowd. That has no incentive to alter the real world to propagate itself. Does he really believe that?
Well, it's a good question. Whereas building God's kingdom on earth is certainly a physical action, and the belief that it's morally imperative is certainly a physical belief. No, it's not a physical belief, because belief is not an act of, as Plantinga said, material cannot be about. It has to be a metaphysical act. Belief has to be a metaphysical act. And as far as I can tell, nobody's ever responded to Plantinga's claim on that, have they, Logos?
I guess I'm confused by the point of contention.
Well, okay, so Plantinga said matter cannot be about things, therefore thought must be a metaphysical, spiritual action.
Right.
And then Moldbug is saying that that one should act, that it is morally imperative is a physical belief. No, there's no such thing as physical beliefs.
He just means a belief about the physical state of affairs.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And it is adaptive. Can Kobe drive the lane? Did Zeppelin rock? Does the Pope, etc.? So when we identify progressive secularism as one thing and Protestant Christianity as another, we've basically just walked up to one of the most dangerous intellectual pathogens in Western history. Said, "How you doing?" Invited it to a wild hot tub party and promised to deactivate our immune system for the evening. Is this safe epistemology? I think not. There was another comment in the thread I wanted to respond to, but I'm out of time for it today, and I'm going to try it tomorrow. Okay, well, this explains literally everything, because I'm like, he has to know what Calvinism really means. And he admits that he does. And then he just frankly either lies about his knowledge of the theonomists and Doug Wilson, which at the time were bugbears being trotted out by the Brahmins, or is too ignorant to know that they existed. And I think I can speak for a lot of people here, and that a lot of unpleasantness on the DR for those of us that are Christians, and more specifically those of us that are Protestant Christians, have come from this. And this is just complete vomit. Like, it's infuriating to see where all of these, like, will to power types came from, and Puritans are progressives came from. It's just like, it really gets me mad.
Understandable.
Okay, why I am not an anti-Semite. June 23rd, 2007. Okay. That's strange. I mean, Moldbug, you're a rootless cosmopolitan. Of course you're not anti-Semite. This is the first in a series of Why I'm Not posts with homage to Bertrand Russell. My plan is to run the political spectrum outside in. Next, why am I not an anarchist? I thought I'd start with this because vacation interrupted me in the middle of an interesting discussion with the anonymous anti-Semitic commenter. I'm not sure if Anon would embrace this adjective, but I'm using it in the same sense as, say, anti-American, which seems perfectly reasonable to me. While I admire Murray Rothbard's definition of an anti-Semite as anyone who proposes legal disabilities against Jews, by this definition, the creed is basically extinct, so it strikes me as sensible to use the adjectives for anyone with negative views on Jews as a whole. Hold on, this is a very interesting move here, Logos, right? Because what did he criticize the left of doing after they won all their battles and the injustices that they were fighting no longer existed? They invented a whole new set of terms, a whole new set of meanings for the old terms to keep the struggle going.
Exactly. Yep.
That's what he's doing right here.
Yep.
He says anti-Semitism doesn't exist, so we're going to invent a new definition to keep it going. I mean, this is literally what he's criticizing the left for doing.
He just can't help himself.
He can't help himself. Well, he's a Brahmin liberal. He says so, right? More specifically, the commentator is a fan of Kevin MacDonald. My views on MacDonald roughly track those of John Derbyshire. MacDonald's response to Derbyshire's essay is here. There are many bad reasons not to be an anti-Semite. For example, anti-Semitism is unfashionable. If you want to be fashionable, don't be an anti-Semite. Obviously, this is not a concern here at Unqualified Reservations. My father is Jewish, at least racially. This does not make me Jewish. What kind of Jew are we talking about here? But it surely makes me suspect, at least to some anti-Semites. I think he means the line of female descent. He might be implying that his mother's not Jewish. So we'll see where he goes with that. But if this was my best reason for not being anti-Semitic, surely it would tend to confirm rather than refute MacDonald's theories. Wow, Kevin MacDonald's been around for that long. Huh. If your father is Catholic, are you not allowed to be anti-Catholic? Okay, now this is a false equivalency, right? Because is he saying that his father practices the Jewish religion? Because he says he's at least racially. But Catholicism is a belief. So is he referring to Judaism as a belief or as an ethnicity? Because of course it's okay, it's natural to be anti-Catholic if your father's Catholic. That's not being anti who your father is as an ethnic group.
Right, exactly.
That's just nonsense. In fact, anti-Semitism, MacDonald style, is probably the most courageous political belief anyone can hold in 2007, at least if you live anywhere west of Gaza City. This does not make it right, but it certainly does not give anyone who believes in diversity and the environment any rights to sneer. I admire conviction. I despise cant. Anti-Semitism was cant in Munich 1936, or in 1886 for that matter. No, it wasn't. Between 1830 and 1930, this was the heyday of philo-Semitism in Germany and Austria-Hungary. And in fact, most Jews after World War II were surprised at the reaction they got. I mean, this guy's just pulling stuff out of his butt. It is at Kent in Tehran today, in California in 2007. It can't be nothing but conviction. And now his argument specifically was that in my classroom of American caste and conflicts, in my discussion of the belief system of the ruling Brahmin caste, I neglected Jewish influence specifically as per MacDonald. I neglected the importance of Jewish intellectuals in the transition of the American establishment from 1920s-style super-Protestantism to post-war secularism and multiculturalism. Basically, the reason I neglected this is that I don't see it. But the point is certainly debatable, so let's debate it. The basic question is whether as I argue, multiculturalism is best understood as a simple development of mainline Protestantism, or as an anonymous belief it should be seen as Jewish Protestant. Oh, okay, I know what he's doing here. So Kevin MacDonald believes that multiculturalism is a Jewish racial preservation strategy. He argues that the Jews bring this up in order to divide the Gentile host nation they live in. And by dividing the Gentile host nation they live in, they can then be safe from any sort of universal ethnic identity backlash, which drove them out of Europe in the Middle Ages. That's why he has to point the finger away, and that's why he's pointing it at the resurrected corpse of Calvinism, a group that doesn't exist. And I think we'll see this come a bit later, but I am familiar enough with MacDonald's work to see why this is happening. If we use the 5 tests of belief system as a classification to ask this question, we get a very interesting result. We have a clear positive one on tests. The cladistic multiculturalism came from the Jewish background. We have a clear negative on the nominalist and typological methods. Multiculturalism does not claim to be Jewish. Yeah, well, multiculturalism doesn't claim to be Calvinist either. So by your own method, that doesn't work. And it's pretty hard to get from massacring the Midianites to supporting open borders. We have what I believe is a false positive on the morphological test. The problem is that not only does Christianity have ancient Jewish roots, but the Puritans of Cromwell's era for some reason developed the Old Testament fetish and decided they were Israelites, which is why boys are still named Jacob or Ezra. What was the reason? Well, Anon argues that this reflects actual Jewish influence. He points to the fact that Cromwell was sent to the expulsion of the Jews from England, but it is a little difficult to figure out how this could possibly have been the result of Jewish scheming. How could you scheme when you're not there? Interesting, Logos. How can you scheme when you're not there? I wonder who that might else apply to, Logos.
I don't know, but I think you're going to tell me.
Yeah, it applies to the Puritans.
Oh, that's a good point. Oh, that's a really good point.
Seriously, what the heck, Logos? Again, WTF. Right there. How can you scheme when you're not there? What have I been saying for the last 3 episodes? This group of people doesn't exist in power structures.
Yep.
The Japanese also have a bizarre fascination with the Jews, and they're not even Christian. Occam's razor tells me the Jewish Odyssey is just a plain good story, especially if you feel persecuted. The Christian identity movement, which is actually anti-Semitic itself, is still pushing this one. If we factor out Hebraic Puritanism, the only significant morphological resemblance between Judaism and multiculturalism is the absence of an afterlife. Significant, perhaps, but as I've pointed out, mainline Protestants have been shedding theological baggage in a frenzy of streamlining for the last 200 years. Emerson had already discarded hell in the 1830s. Rumors that he was born Ralph Waldo Emerstein are, as far as I'm concerned, unsubstantiated. We are only left with the adaptive test. This, of course, is MacDonald's favorite. But MacDonald uses it in a very bizarre way. It's not just that he believes in group selection, he believes in group action. I believe in human action. A group is not a person. Okay, this is where you have the collective racialist versus the individualist. It is perfectly possible that Germans, Jews, or Irishmen are full of Caledonian asabiah and act collectively in ways that favor Germans, Sioux, or Irishmen. But in order for this to work, you need a cohesive belief system that renders altruism on behalf of the group and discourages defecting actions that would otherwise favor the individual. You need, in other words, an actual movement of ethnic nationalism. Of course, Judaism... Well, by that logic, Logos, you'd need to have an active movement of neo-Calvinism. To have any sort of... But we don't have that.
Yep.
Huh. Interesting. Of course, Judaism has this in theory. The whole Torah is a story of pure asabiah. The Jews get their asses kicked when they're divided. They kick ass when they're together. But just as Christianity is not the Bible, Judaism is not the Torah. It's an evolving system like any other. Is there any Jewish ethnic nationalism in the 20th century? There certainly is. But it is found among Zionists, Hasidim, etc., and certainly not among Reformed socialist Jews. Oh, you know what, Logos? There is a neo-Calvinism that exists in the 20th century, but it's not found in New England. What do you know?
Wow.
What do you know? It's found in the South and the West.
Yo, man, crazy.
Crazy. For example, Reformed Judaism is almost non-existent in Israel. I think there is a Jewish influence in ultra-Calvinism, but I think it is exactly the opposite of what MacDonald's theories suggest. What we are seeing is not syncretism, it is assimilation. Basically, the Jews, like my ancestors who came to the U.S., were people who wanted to get ahead as individuals. They were done with the ghetto and the shtetl. They wanted money and power, doesn't everyone? I mean, Logos, is this really all going to be a power fantasy of a butthurt Jew who's tired of being on the run? Like, that is like the most stereotypical thing you can think of.
I'm just confused. I mean, if it comes down to the lust for money and power, getting people assimilated into larger systems, then I don't understand what the point is of why wasn't Christianity assimilated? Why wasn't any other thing he blames? Why wasn't universalism assimilated? Maybe the guy that dropped hell, Emerson, in the 1830s, he was assimilated and he did it for money and power, right? If we're just going to play this assimilation game, you can do assimilation all the way down. So his entire morphology just collapses if that's going to be the standard.
Yeah, it does. It's only natural, therefore, that they would be drawn to the social patterns of the most prestigious class in the new country, the mainline super Protestants. Like most converts, they adopted the most fashionable views of the Brahmin elite, which has already well down the road towards secularization and Unitarianism in the modern sense of the word. Again, let's be clear here. What are the metaphysical beliefs of Unitarianism and Transcendentalism? I mean, a lot of it's just Hindu Eastern mysticism. So it doesn't have any commonality with Jews or Christians, even though they might have, quote, taken over churches, quote unquote. For indeed, the earlier arriving, and as much as I hate to admit it, since my ancestors spoke jargon, more cultured German Jews, much of this process had already happened in Europe. Reformed Judaism is pretty much Protestantism in all but name. That's complete crap, but okay. As is, of course, scientific Marxist socialism. Whereas the Brahmins had no reason at all to adopt Jewish ways of thought, nor do I see any way in which they did. The assimilation was entirely in the other direction. The daughters of the Mayflower did not learn Yiddish. There was certainly no denying that the injection of smart Jews into the Brahmin caste made it all the more successful, which presumably has contributed to the incredible arrogance with which it bestrides the world today. But I simply do not see the Jewish asabiya, which is why I will continue to lay the whole trip on the Calvinists. But wait a minute. Asabiya is the idea of this national story of being united, but then the Calvinists adopted the Jewish position. So how is it still not their fault? Like, I don't get this.
Mysterious assimilation solves everything, Todd.
Okay. Now Anonymous
Schrodinger's assimilation.
There we go. Schrodinger's. Yeah, if it's when do we apply it or not? We don't know. You have to open the box. Now Anonymous has an advantage in that he has actually read MacDonald's books, as opposed to just a couple of essays. And he is surely right to note that MacDonald has an enormous mass of corroborating evidence, because all historians do. Well, this implies Moldbug is not a historian because he's provided no corroborating evidence, but I digress. A historian is not a mere collector of facts. He or she is creating an interpretation, much like a trial lawyer. The goal of history is to paint a picture of the past. The test for any reader is simply whether you find that picture convincing. Volume of evidence has not much to do with it. Oh, it has everything to do with it. Or are we talking about court? You said court, so yeah, that's exactly how you decide a trial in a court. Where does the preponderance of evidence go? Now, if you're going to say that it's all about, spinning yarns and evidence be damned, well, then I mean that's just all of the pathologies of the left that you claim to have been fighting. The idea that there's some deep, dark, right-wing conspiracy about to bring us back to the dark days of Selma. So, in fact, it is often a contrary indicator, because a lawyer with a weak case often feels the temptation to try to inundate the jury with a vast mass of detail.
Who does that sound like?
It sounds like one Mencius Moldbug.
It does.
Yeah, disconnected detail as well. The strategy is essentially to demand that reader either agree or to do the work of assembling the same detail into a counter-narrative. The canonical example is Johann Cochrane's Great Gambit. If the gloves don't fit, you must acquit. Although you've often seen the same strategy in revisionists, such as Jerner Rudolph, MacDonald does not claim to be a revisionist, and I'm not accusing him of being one. Why didn't the gloves fit? Why weren't the gas chamber walls stained blue? The only possible answer is who the hell knows. These are all sorts of chemical and physical processes that can cause leather to shrink, Prussian blue to decay, etc., etc. There's no evidence, there can be no evidence for any particular one of them. Forcing your opponent to prove a negative is not a legitimate rhetorical tactic.
Okay. How is he not forcing Protestant Christians to prove that progressivism is not them, or they are not progressive?
I mean, what this sounds like, this guy is just an a-hole who got tired of fighting with gnat socks and then attacked Protestant Christians for no reason.
Sounds like it to me.
That's literally what this whole thing is. He's arguing with Nat Socks and the original ethno-nationalist alt-right, who, by the way, hate Protestants for being Jewish, right? That's what they'd say. And instead of just defeating them on their own terms, like a complete a-hole, he just shoots somebody randomly in the crowd.
Yep.
Like, wow. As a member of the jury, we have to evaluate the totality of the evidence on both sides. But wait, I thought we were against juries, and I thought Moldbug says we can just dispense with evaluating the actual doctrines of Calvinism. We have to look at both pictures. We have no time machines. We cannot expect perfect. Oh, now you know what it is, Logos? It's Schrodinger's both sides. Because if it's the tribe, then we better judiciously analyze both sides. But if it's some random guy on the street who's a fundamentalist, well, we'll just shoot him and nobody cares.
Basically.
My view is that the picture that show OJ as the killer and the thing that happened in 1945 as a German war crime are much more convincing than the pictures that show OJ being framed by the LAPD and the thing that happened in 1945 as Allied propaganda. Well, by that argument, there's nothing to stand on Calvinism. Because A, it did exist in the aughts, Theonomy and Jug Wilson, and the Puritans were already gone, so they couldn't have done anything.
Right.
And similarly, I think the history of the American intellectual elite is much more of Jewish assimilation than Jewish infiltration. But of course, I'm perfectly ready to be proven wrong on any of these issues. My patience is not unlimited, but one of the trials of having unpopular opinions is that you find it difficult to condemn others for their own unpopular opinions. I actually view this as a benefit rather than a trial, but the Jew in me feels free to complain about it anyway. And you know what really shows you the ungratefulness of this guy? What did he say about Cromwell? Cromwell brought the Jews back to England. He says it here. He points out that Cromwell rescinded the expulsion of the Jews from England. He can't even say thanks to the group of people that actually helped his out. And he attacks them when the Natsocks come after him. What kind of perverted, warped psychopath is this guy?
I don't know. I care less about the fact that he's a psychopath and care more about the fact that he's just downright inconsistent all the time.
I mean, that too, but part of my purpose for this Moldbug Matrix was, of course, to deconstruct the cathedral, but also to figure out where do all these Moldbugian ideas and tropes come from.
Mm-hmm.
And to make a long story short, to get to where I am in the movement here, I had to get through a lot of crap that was downstream from Moldbug.
Yeah.
And I initially was going to assume that this was just Moldbug being careless and goofy and that there was nothing substantial to it. That would have been bad enough, but this makes it really bad in my mind. This is like completely... Yeah, it's like, what the heck? It's like, no good deed goes unpunished. I mean, that would be like today if say the rootless cosmopolitans attacked America, even though America helped fight NS.
Right.
That's literally the same kind of thing we're talking about. And so, yeah, it's, yeah. I mean, at this point, I think the next article would take too long to get through. So I think we can wrap up with our thoughts. The thought that I have to end with here is that, I just didn't realize that the whole, because it's a twofold argument that has had two morphs in the DR. One morph is that this is all just Christianity in toto. And that's where you get people like AA, people like a Bronze's pervert, obviously the old NS crowd, which is gone since Charlottesville, and they've been making this point again and again and again. So they embraced Moldbug when it suited their purposes, and then second of all, the idea that it's the Puritans more narrowly And of course, that came up in the debate that I had on Andy Worski, which again is complete crap. And of course, these terms are plastic and ill-defined, so they can include anyone. And then, so there's that discrete issue, right? And the other discrete issue is none of the terms are consistent. I mean, he'll use a word 3 different ways within 3 articles. Also, as a historian, there's this. That's the other thing downstream from Moldbug that I've been fighting all these years, is these completely insane, bonkers readings of history that have absolutely nothing to do with anything. And it's like, I wondered, like, where was this coming from? Because it makes it really hard to build a actual body of work and knowledge that can accomplish something tangible and useful in the world. And it turns out a lot of it's downstream from Moldbug just having diarrhea of the mouth. And the other thing is, with regards to his, just crazy ideas, like you said, they're not defined, they're contradictory. What does this even mean? Hasn't advanced the narrative at all. What is interesting is that what provoked doing these streams was the timing. The fact that Moldbug had finally shown his true colors to all of his supporters. So something that I had I think the difference between, say, someone like me and someone like Charlie is that Charlie, well, no, he was attacking Catholics. I was going to say Charlie wasn't being directly attacked by Moldbug, but my position was. But that's not strictly speaking true, because he does attack Catholics a lot. I think it's because people like that are computer programmers. And then the third thing we learned was, how did Moldbug propagate all this vomit all over the internet? And it was because he uses computer language talking points to talk to other computer programmers who then agree with the mechanism by which the ideas are communicated, not the ideas themselves per se.
I don't got much to add to that.
Well, yeah, at this point, I think no one says if you're going to be a psychopath, at least be consistent. I know.
Unironically, I mean, psychopaths exist, right? You can't just root them out. There's no magic wand you're going to wave to make psychopaths go away. The very best I can hope for when I'm surrounded by people that do and believe crazy things sometimes is, can I consistently at least predict what they're going to behave and what they're going to do based on their beliefs? If I at least have that, I can at least know whether I should befriend them, run, get out of the way, right? Like, can I at least make that basic decision, with these crazy people I meet? And if they're not inconsistent, the answer is just no, because they can do one thing today and another thing tomorrow based on the same beliefs, because they don't really have a consistent way they do their beliefs. So yeah, no, unironically, I'd rather a consistent psychopath than not.
Well, yeah, you want the guy from No Country for Old Men, Anton.
I've never seen that movie, but I've seen some clips from it. I really got to see that movie.
Well, he's basically the lawful evil because he has a code.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why Moldbug had the whole D&D thing, because he's chaotic evil, and he doesn't want people to know that.
Ah, well, chaotic is just evil by definition, and so it's all evil. What are you going to do?
There you go. Let's see. Zero World. Moldbug might just win in the end, starting to drive Todd and Logos crazy. No, I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, I've been through worse.
Crazy. Yeah, I'm mentally tired after going through these and trying to make sense of them, try to make them as consistent with previous things he said as I can, realizing article by article that it was futile to try, and you just can't salvage them anyway.
Okay. This is it. This is my final statement, Logos. I'm going to sum up Moldbug in a final sentence.
Have fun.
Moldbug is a Stirnerite illegalist motivated by ethnic resentment. Okay, so one of the reasons why he just eviscerates all meaning is it's a kind of like, the sort of like propaganda of the deed, where you just smash all institutions, all structures, in this kind of Stirnerite illegalism. And what's motivating him to do this is ethnic resentment.
I'm not prepared to go that deep into psychoanalysis. I just care about whether he's consistent or not. So I'll let you have fun with that.
Fair enough. But all right, guys. This is Todd Lewis, Praise the Fight Podcast, signing off.